Pain bloomed across Sera's back like wildfire. The leather whip cracked again. Her knees buckled against the wooden post, splinters digging into her palms as she gripped the rough surface. Each strike sent lightning through her spine, yet she bit her tongue until copper flooded her mouth. "You think you're better than us?" Betathorn's voice dripped with venom. "Your father thought that too." The mountain wind howled through the compound, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her bruised skin. But that was impossible. Her wolf had been silent for months, beaten into submission, just like the rest of her. "Answer me." The whip whistled through the air. "No, Beta," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "I know my place." Truth be told, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than broken. 2 years since her father's rebellion. 2 years of being payment for his defiance. 2 years of learning that hope was just another word for foolishness. Still, as Thorn's shadow loomed over her, something flickered in her chest. Maybe it was the strange new scent on the wind, pine and leather and something wild that made her pulse quicken. Or maybe it was the way the moon seemed brighter tonight, casting silver light across the whipping post like a spotlight. "That's right," Thorn snarled, his breath hot against her ear. "You're nothing. Property. A reminder to anyone who thinks they can challenge pack law." Her fingers dug deeper into the wood, between the burning stripes across her back and the familiar shame crawling through her veins. Sera felt her spirit crack a little more. Yet somewhere in the darkness behind her closed eyes, something golden flickered. What she didn't know was that golden eyes watched from the shadows, eyes that burned with a fury that could level mountains.
Kieran's claws extended involuntarily as he watched the beta's whip fall again. From his hiding spot in the pine grove, every instinct screamed at him to intervene. His wolf paced beneath his skin, demanding blood, demanding justice for the small figure tied to that post. But revealing himself now would destroy weeks of careful investigation. Next, the scent hit him fully. Pain, terror, but underneath it all, mate. His world tilted. That broken girl, the one being tortured like an animal, was his Luna, his other half. The bond snapped into place with such force it nearly drove him to his knees. "No, Beta, I know my place." Her voice, so small and defeated, shattered something inside his chest. What followed was a rage so pure it threatened to shift him right there in the shadows, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, brought low by the sound of his mate's surrender. More importantly, he could see what others couldn't. Even broken, even bleeding, she held herself with quiet dignity. Her spirit might be cracked, but it wasn't destroyed. Not yet. As the beta finally stepped back, Kieran forced himself to remain hidden. Soon after, he would reveal himself, but not like this. Not when his mate was vulnerable and bleeding. That night, as he watched Thorn drag her away, Kieran made a silent vow. The beta would pay for every mark on her skin, every tear, every moment of fear. What's worse, he could smell her wolf, suppressed but not gone. Someone had been systematically breaking her, keeping her from her true nature. Come morning, everything would change. The mountain pack's territory reeked of fear. Kieran adjusted the worn leather satchel across his shoulder, playing his part as a traveling merchant. The disguise came easily: rougher clothes, a day's stubble, and the careful suppression of his alpha presence. To these wolves, he was nobody special. Despite that, his senses painted a different picture entirely. Terror hung in the air like smoke, submission so thick it coated his tongue. This wasn't a healthy pack. This was a dictatorship ruled through brutality. Even so, they'd managed to stay under his radar until reports of unusual pack dynamics reached his court. Now, he understood. Beta Thorn wasn't just managing territory, he was breaking spirits. "You looking for anything particular, stranger?" A young pack member approached, his movements careful and measured. Everything about his posture screamed of someone who'd learned to be invisible. "Just passing through," Kieran replied, keeping his voice neutral. Heard you might have supplies for trade. In fact, he was mapping every building, every guard position, every possible escape route, because something told him he'd need them soon. Beta's got to approve all trades. The young wolf's eyes darted nervously toward the main lodge. He don't like surprises. Before Kieran could respond, movement caught his eye. A flash of dark hair disappearing around a corner. Quick, furtive, like someone who'd learned to move through shadows. His wolf perked up instantly. On the other hand, he forced himself to focus on the conversation. Patience. Investigation first. Justice would come. When might I speak with your beta? Tonight, pack meeting. The young wolf stepped back. But maybe reconsider. Thorn ain't in a good mood lately. As the wolf hurried away, Kieran allowed himself a grim smile. If his suspicions were correct, Thorn's mood was about to get much, much worse. Meanwhile, that tantalizing scent lingered just at the edge of his consciousness, calling to him like a siren song.
Sera pressed herself against the supply shed wall, heart hammering against her ribs. A stranger in their territory meant trouble. Strangers asked questions. Questions led to attention. And attention always, always led to punishment. Rather than risk being seen, she ducked behind the first building she could find. Now she waited, counting her breaths and praying the newcomer would move on quickly. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she caught glimpses of him. Tall, broad shoulders that moved with predatory grace, dark hair that caught the afternoon light. Something about him made her wolf stir, which was impossible. Her wolf had been silent for so long she'd started to believe it was truly gone. Between one breath and the next, the wind shifted. His scent hit her like a physical blow. Pine forests and leather, yes, but underneath, power. The kind that made lesser wolves drop to their knees. The kind that meant alpha. Her body moved on instinct, shrinking further into the shadows. Alphas meant danger. They meant politics and power plays that small, broken omegas got crushed beneath. Without warning, he turned. For one terrifying heartbeat, she thought he'd spotted her. His head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring like he was scenting the air. Those eyes, even from a distance, they seemed to glow with inner fire. Then Jorik called out to him, and the moment shattered. The stranger turned away, and Sera finally remembered how to breathe. Still, as she watched him walk toward the main compound, something deep inside her whispered that her world had just shifted on its axis. What scared her more? That feeling or how desperately she wanted to follow it? The pack meeting felt different tonight. Sera knelt in her designated spot at the very back of the gathering, behind the omegas, behind the children, behind everyone who mattered. Her back still burned from last night's punishment, but she'd learned to hide pain like other people hid secrets. Yet something electric hummed through the crowd. Whispered conversations, sideways glances, the kind of tension that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. Quiet. Thorn's voice boomed across the clearing. We have a visitor. The stranger stepped forward, and Sera's breath caught. Up close, he was devastating. Not handsome in the pretty way of pack princes, but beautiful like a blade, all sharp edges and controlled power. When he moved, every wolf in the clearing instinctively tracked his movements. More importantly, his scent wrapped around her like silk and steel. Name's Blake, he said, his voice carrying easily across the space. Looking for trade opportunities. Heard this pack might be interested. Thorn's eyes narrowed. We're particular about who we do business with. What makes you think you have anything we want? As if pulled by a string, the stranger's gaze swept the crowd. Sera tried to make herself smaller, but those eyes, golden and intense, found her anyway. The moment their eyes locked, her world exploded. Power, recognition, something ancient and primal that made her wolf howl with longing. For one impossible second, she felt whole again, complete, like every broken piece of her soul had suddenly remembered how to fit together. No matter how hard she tried to look away, she couldn't break the connection. Those golden eyes held her captive, seeing straight through her careful masks to the girl underneath. Deep down, she knew the truth. This stranger wasn't just dangerous. He was hers. Before she could process that terrifying thought, Thorne's hand cracked across her cheek. "Eyes down, worthless bitch!" The beta's snarl shattered the moment. "How dare you stare at your betters?"
The sound of flesh meeting flesh ignited something murderous in Kieran's chest. His mate, because there was no doubt now, not after that soul-deep recognition, touched her reddening cheek with trembling fingers. The gesture was so achingly vulnerable it nearly broke his carefully maintained control. Even so, he forced himself to remain still. One wrong move now could get her killed. "Forgive the interruption," he said smoothly, though his voice carried an edge that made several wolves step back. "Perhaps we could discuss business elsewhere?" Thorne's cruel smile widened. "No need. Everyone here knows their place." His hand tangled in the girl's dark hair, jerking her head back. This one's father thought he was special too. Thought he could challenge pack law. Fire raced through Kieran's veins. That's why she was here. Payment for someone else's rebellion. His mate, reduced to a living reminder of what happened to those who defied the beta's will. Truth be told, it took every ounce of his royal training not to shift and tear Thorne's throat out right there. "Discipline is important in a pack," he managed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. What followed was the longest performance of his life. Nodding, agreeing, playing the part of a merchant impressed by Thorne's leadership, while his mate knelt in the dirt, radiating pain and resignation. But as the meeting progressed, Kieran caught something else in her scent. Beneath the fear and hurt, something wild stirred. Her wolf recognized him too, and it was fighting to break free. As the crowd began to disperse, he allowed himself one last look. Those dark eyes met his again, and this time he let her see the promise burning in his gaze. Soon, little wolf. Very soon, Kieran circled the compound like a predator mapping his territory. The merchant act had bought him access, but every instinct screamed at him to find his mate and eliminate the threat keeping her caged. 2 hours had passed since the meeting, and her scent still clung to his consciousness like smoke. After that, he'd learned the layout. Guard rotations, weak points in their defenses, the beta's quarters, where he'd probably find the real information about what was happening here. What he hadn't expected was to catch her scent again, moving toward the edge of the compound. Following the trail, he found himself at what looked like a herb garden, small, well-tended, hidden behind the storage buildings. And there she was. His mate knelt among the plants, her movements careful and practiced as she gathered something green into a worn basket. Moonlight turned her dark hair silver and highlighted the graceful curve of her neck. For a moment, Kieran simply watched. Here, away from the pack's eyes, she seemed different, less broken, more like the fierce Luna he sensed lurking beneath her careful submission. That night, he made his decision. Stepping from the shadows, he cleared his throat softly. She spun around, eyes wide with fear, basket clutched against her chest like a shield. "Easy," he murmured, raising his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her scent spiked with terror, but underneath it something else bloomed. Recognition. The same pull that had nearly driven him to his knees during the meeting. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice barely audible. "If Thorne finds you, let me worry about Thorne." He took a careful step closer, the way he might approach a wounded animal. "What's your name?" She hesitated, warring with herself. "Sera," she finally breathed. "Sera." The name felt like a prayer on his tongue. "You don't belong here, do you?" Something cracked in her carefully controlled expression. "I belong exactly where I am. Payment for my father's crimes." The bitter resignation in her voice made his wolf snarl. But beneath it, he caught something else, a flicker of the fire he knew burned inside her. "And if I told you that was a lie?" he asked softly. "What then?" Before she could answer, voices echoed from the main compound. Sera's face went white with panic. "Go," she hissed. "Please, you don't understand what he'll do if—" "I understand more than you know." His eyes burned gold in the moonlight. "This isn't over, Sera." As he melted back into the shadows, Kieran heard her whispered response carried on the wind. "Nothing ever is."
Long after the stranger vanished, Sera remained frozen in the garden. Her hands shook as she tried to process what had just happened. The way he'd looked at her, not with pity or disgust, but like she mattered. Like she was worth something more than the pain Thorn carved into her flesh each night. Meanwhile, her wolf clawed at the walls of her consciousness, desperate to follow his scent into the darkness. "This isn't over, Sera." His words echoed in her mind like a promise. But promises were dangerous things for girls like her. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the cost of disappointment was measured in blood and broken bones. Still, as she made her way back toward the compound, something had shifted inside her chest. The stranger, Blake, had seen her, really seen her, and for one impossible moment, she'd felt like the girl she used to be. The girl who believed in happy endings. What she didn't know was that come morning, her world would shatter and rebuild itself in ways she never could have imagined. Because the golden-eyed stranger wasn't just a merchant passing through. He was her salvation. And he was about to turn her entire existence upside down.
Dawn hadn't even touched the mountain peaks when Kieran heard the screaming. His blood turned to ice as Sera's voice tore through the morning air. Raw, desperate, echoing off the stone walls of the compound. Every instinct he possessed roared at him to run toward that sound, but years of tactical training kept him hidden in the shadows of the storage shed. Next, he forced himself to move carefully through the darkness, following the sounds of struggle to a clearing behind the main lodge. What he found there nearly drove him to his knees. Sera hung from a wooden frame, her wrists bound with rough rope that had already cut deep grooves into her skin. Blood trickled down her arms like crimson tears. Thorn stood behind her, a barbed whip coiled in his massive fist. "You think I didn't see you talking to that stranger last night?" The beta's voice dripped with malicious pleasure. "Think I don't know when my property is getting ideas above her station?" The whip cracked across her bare back, and Sera's scream shattered something fundamental in Kieran's chest. His wolf clawed at his consciousness, demanding blood, demanding justice for every mark on his mate's skin. Despite that, he couldn't reveal himself. Not yet. Moving too soon would get them both killed. "I wasn't—" Sera's voice broke as another lash fell. "Please, I didn't do anything. Lying makes it worse." Thorn's laugh was pure poison. "Your father was a liar too. Look where it got him." As if fate demanded it, Sera's head turned slightly, and her pain-glazed eyes met Kieran's through the darkness. The recognition that flashed between them was instant and devastating, a bond snapping into place with such force it nearly brought him to his knees. In that moment, Kieran saw past her carefully constructed walls, saw the fierce spirit that Thorn was systematically trying to break, saw his Luna, broken but not defeated, bleeding but still breathing, still fighting. Without another word, he stepped back into the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. Soon, very soon, the beta would pay for every tear on his mate's face.
Pain bloomed across Sera's back like liquid fire, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her chest. He'd seen her. The golden-eyed stranger, Blake, had witnessed her shame, her weakness, her complete and utter powerlessness. The humiliation burned worse than any whip. Rather than look away in disgust like she expected, something fierce and protective had blazed in those impossible eyes, something that whispered promises she didn't dare believe. "Look at me when I'm punishing you," Thorn snarled, jerking her chin up with brutal fingers. "This is what happens when worthless Omegas forget their place." The leather bit into her flesh again, and Sera bit her tongue until copper flooded her mouth. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing her break. Not completely. Not while those golden eyes might still be watching. What followed was an eternity of fire across her skin. Each strike designed not just to punish, but to humiliate. To remind her that she was nothing, property. A living example of what happened to those who dared to dream. Come morning, when Thorne finally tired of his game, Sera hung limp in her bonds. Blood painted her back in abstract patterns, and her spirit felt cracked down to the foundation. Yet as the beta cut her down and let her collapse to the dirt, something stubborn flickered in her chest. The stranger's eyes had held promises, dangerous, impossible promises that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her broken skin. "Next time you even look at another male without permission," Thorne whispered against her ear, "I'll make you watch while I flay the skin from his bones, understand?" Sera nodded weakly, but inside, rebellion sparked like flint against steel. Next time, she might not be so powerless.
Rage was a living thing in Kieran's chest as he strode into the main lodge 3 hours later. The merchant mask felt like lead on his shoulders, but he wore it anyway, even as every cell in his body screamed for Thorne's blood. His mate's scream still echoed in his memory, fuel for the fire burning in his veins. Still, he needed information before he could act. Politics, unfortunately, required more finesse than simple violence. "Blake," Thorne looked up from his breakfast with false enthusiasm. "Hope the noise this morning didn't disturb your rest. Sometimes discipline can't wait for civilized hours." It took every ounce of Kieran's royal training not to shift and tear the beta's throat out right there. "Pack business is pack business," he replied smoothly. "Though I have to admit curiosity about your methods." "Oh, that." Thorne waved dismissively. "Just a reminder for one of my more troublesome possessions. Her father tried to challenge my authority a few years back, thought his bloodline made him special. From there, the pieces began clicking into place. Sera's father hadn't just been any pack member. He'd been a potential rival, someone with enough influence to threaten Thorne's grip on power. "What happened to him?" Kieran asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Thorne's smile turned predatory. "Hunting accident. Very tragic. Left behind a daughter who needed guidance." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Murder. Sera's father had been murdered, and she'd been kept as a living trophy. A reminder of what happened to anyone who dared oppose the beta's rule. More importantly, Kieran was beginning to understand the true scope of the corruption here. This wasn't just a pack with discipline problems. This was a dictatorship built on fear, murder, and systematic abuse. "She seems broken," he observed carefully. "Exactly as she should be." Thorne's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Took 2 years, but I finally taught her proper respect. Amazing what a little consistent correction can accomplish." The casual pride in the beta's voice made Kieran's vision blur red. His mate, his Luna, reduced to a broken toy for this monster's amusement. Before he could respond, commotion erupted outside. Shouts, running footsteps, the kind of chaos that usually meant trouble. That night, everything would change.
Sera pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the root cellar, every muscle screaming in protest. Her back felt like it had been dipped in acid, and moving sent lightning bolts of agony down her spine. But she'd learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. Better to hide until the worst of the damage healed. Meanwhile, voices drifted down from the main compound. Angry voices, the kind that usually meant someone was about to suffer. Through the narrow window, she caught glimpses of movement. Pack members running back and forth, Thorne's bellowing voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Then she heard it, a name that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Find him! Blake couldn't have gotten far." Panic clawed at her throat. Something had happened. Something involving the golden-eyed stranger who'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth saving. As a result, terror and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope, warred in her chest. Had he done something stupid? Something that would get him killed? Between one heartbeat and the next, the cellar door burst open. "There you are." Thorne's massive frame filled the doorway, his face twisted with fury. "Your new friend decided to ask some very interesting questions about your father." Sera's heart stopped. "I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me." His hand closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground with casual brutality. "What did you tell him about Aldrich?" Her father's name, spoken aloud for the first time in 2 years, hit her like a physical blow. Aldrich Ashwood, the alpha who dared to stand up to Thorne's growing tyranny, the father who died because he'd believed in something better. "Nothing," she gasped, clawing at Thorne's iron grip. "I told him nothing." Truth be told, she hadn't even known the stranger was asking questions. But the fear in Thorne's eyes told her everything she needed to know. Blake wasn't just a merchant, and whatever he'd discovered had the beta running scared.
Kieran had heard enough. 3 hours of careful investigation had painted a picture that made his wolf howl for vengeance. Aldrich Ashwood, Sera's father, had been the rightful alpha of this territory. Thorne had murdered him in cold blood, seized control through fear and violence, and kept Sera as both trophy and torture victim. More importantly, every moment his mate spent in that monster's hands was another crack in Kieran's carefully maintained control. "Enough," he growled, letting his merchant mask finally slip. The temperature in the lodge seemed to drop 10 degrees as his true nature pressed against the air like a physical weight. Pack members who'd been lounging around the fire suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, their instincts screaming warnings. Thorne looked up from his meal, confusion flickering across his brutal features. "What did you say?" "I said enough." Kieran's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command, the voice of an alpha who'd never learned to back down. "Release the girl. Now." Despite that, Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I don't know who you think you are, stranger, but I'm Kieran Blackthorne." The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and that girl you've been torturing belongs to me." The effect was immediate and devastating. Every wolf in the lodge dropped to their knees as the full weight of his royal presence crashed over them. Thorne's face went ash-white, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. What followed was chaos. Shouting, challenges, Thorne's desperate attempts to justify the unjustifiable while Kieran's power filled the space like smoke. She's payment for her father's crimes. Her father was murdered. Kieran's eyes blazed gold. "You murdered the rightful alpha and kept his daughter as a plaything. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" As the truth hung in the air between them, Kieran felt his mate's presence like a beacon. She was close, hurt, terrified, but alive. Soon after, he would make Thorne pay for every moment of her suffering. But first he had a Luna to claim.
The world exploded around Sera like glass hitting stone. Power rolled through the compound in waves, pure alpha dominance that made every wolf for miles drop to their knees in automatic submission. But this wasn't the crude brutality of Thorne's rule. This was something ancient and terrible and beautiful, like standing in the path of a hurricane. Next, she heard the voice that made her soul sing. "I'm Kieran Blackthorne, Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The merchant was the Alpha King. The golden-eyed stranger who'd looked at her like she mattered was the most powerful wolf in the Northern Kingdoms, and he was here. For her. Without warning, the cellar door shattered under the force of a massive fist. "Get away from her!" Thorne's face was a mask of rage and desperation as he dragged her up by her hair. "She's mine! Payment for her father's rebellion!" But even as he spoke, Sera could smell his fear. Acrid. Desperate. The scent of a predator who'd suddenly found himself facing something bigger and deadlier. Through the broken doorway, she caught glimpses of the chaos above. Pack members scattering like leaves. Shouts of "Alpha King" and "Blackthorne" echoing off the stone walls. Then he appeared in the doorway, and Sera's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the careful merchant from before. This was a king in his full power. golden eyes blazing with fury, every line of his body radiating lethal intent. When he looked at her, she felt the bond between them snap taut like a wire. "Let her go," he said quietly, and something in his voice made the stone walls seem to tremble. "And I might let you live." As if the world narrowed to this single moment, Sera realized her life was about to change forever. Whether she was ready or not, time seemed to slow as Kieran stepped into the cellar, power rolling off him in waves. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was begging him to save her or to leave before Thorn did something that would get them both killed. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." His voice was gentle now, meant only for her. "Your father was Alpha Aldrich Ashwood. Thorn murdered him and stole his territory. You've been paying for crimes you never committed." The words hit her like physical blows. Her father's name. The truth she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it was a dream. Hearing it spoken aloud in Kieran's careful tone made something crack inside her chest. Rather than relief, panic flooded her system. "No," she breathed. "He'll kill you. You don't know what he's capable of." "He can try." Golden eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her wolf howl with recognition. Not just power, but absolute certainty. This wasn't a male who'd ever learned to lose. Still, Thorn's grip on her hair tightened painfully. "She's mine," he snarled, desperation making his voice crack. "I've broken her, trained her. She knows her place." "Do you?" Kieran asked her directly, ignoring Thorn entirely. "Do you know your place, Sera Ashwood?" Her father's name attached to hers like a crown she'd never been allowed to wear. For 2 years, she'd been nothing but the trader's daughter or property or payment. Hearing her real name in the Alpha King's voice made tears burn behind her eyes. What followed was the hardest moment of her life. Looking into those golden eyes, she saw everything she could be, everything she'd lost, everything that might be possible if she was brave enough to reach for it. Between them, something cracked. Not breaking, but opening. Like a door she'd thought was locked forever. "My place," she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is not on my knees." That night, as Kieran's smile blazed like sunlight and Thorn's face twisted with rage, Sera made her choice. She stopped being a victim and started being a survivor.
Pride flooded Kieran's chest as he watched his mate find her voice. Even bloodied and broken, even after 2 years of systematic abuse, the fire in her still burned. His Luna was in there, waiting to be reclaimed. All she'd needed was someone to remind her who she really was. Truth be told, watching her stand up to her tormentor was one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen. "Sera Ashwood," he said formally, letting power ring in his voice. "I, Kieran Blackthorne, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, claim you under ancient law. You are no longer property. You are no longer payment. You are mine to protect." The claiming words hung in the air like a bell, and he felt the exact moment they took hold. The bond between them blazed to life. Not complete. Not yet. But real enough to make them both gasp. Meanwhile, Thorn's face cycled through confusion, rage, and dawning horror. "You can't. She's mine by right." "What right?" Kieran's voice could have cut glass. "The right of a usurper who murdered her father, the right of a coward who tortures defenseless girls." As the truth of his situation finally penetrated Thorn's thick skull, the beta released Sera and lunged. It was the last mistake he ever made. Kieran moved like lightning, catching the bigger male mid-leap and driving him into the stone wall with bone-crushing force. The sound of Thorn's ribs snapping echoed through the small space like gunshots. "You want to fight?" Kieran's eyes blazed as his claws extended. "Let's fight." What followed wasn't really a battle, it was an execution. Years of rage at seeing his mate suffer poured out in controlled violence. Every blow was calculated. every strike designed to cause maximum pain without granting the mercy of quick death. When it was over, Thorne lay motionless on the cellar floor, breathing but broken beyond repair. The Northern Territories have a new alpha, Kieran announced to the stunned pack members gathering at the cellar entrance. Any who wish to challenge that can step forward now. No one moved. As he turned back to Sera, Kieran saw his own wonder reflected in her dark eyes. The impossible had happened. She was free. They were bound, and nothing would ever be the same. "Ready to go home, little wolf?" he asked softly. For the first time in 2 years, Sera smiled.
Sera's eyes flew open to silk and sunlight. For one terrifying moment, she thought she was dreaming. The bed beneath her was softer than clouds, draped in midnight blue fabric that probably cost more than her father's entire house. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, painting everything in gold and warmth. Then her back shifted against the pillows, and reality crashed back in waves of fire. "Easy," a familiar voice murmured from somewhere nearby. "The healer said you'd be sore for a few days." Kieran sat in a chair beside the bed, no longer wearing his merchant disguise. Now he looked every inch the Alpha King, dark hair perfectly styled, wearing clothes that screamed wealth and power. Yet his golden eyes held the same gentle concern she remembered from the cellar. Still, panic clawed at her throat. This was too good, too perfect. Men like him didn't save girls like her without expecting something in return. "What do you want?" The words scraped her throat raw. Something flickered across his face, hurt, maybe, or disappointment. "I want you to heal, to rest, to remember what it feels like to be safe." Safe. She tested the word like it might explode. Nothing's safe. There's always a price. From there, the conversation took on a surreal quality. He spoke of freedom, of choices, of a future where she didn't have to fear every shadow. She listened with growing disbelief, waiting for the catch, for the moment when the mask would slip and reveal the monster underneath. What followed was the strangest hour of her life. He brought her food, real food, not scraps, and didn't demand anything in return. He explained where she was, what had happened, why she was here. His voice stayed gentle, patient, like he had all the time in the world. Meanwhile, her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, drawn to his scent but confused by the lack of threat. This male smelled like home and safety and forever, but her mind couldn't process those concepts anymore. "I don't understand," she finally whispered. "Why would you do this? Why would you care about someone like me?" Before he could answer, a knock echoed through the chamber. Kieran's expression darkened slightly as a woman entered, tall, elegant, with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. "Your Majesty," the woman said with a slight bow, "the council is asking when you plan to return the girl to her pack." The words hit Sera like a physical blow. Of course, this had all been too good to be true.
Kieran felt his mate's hope shatter like glass. The scent of her despair flooded the room, so sharp and devastating it made his wolf snarl with protective fury. After everything she'd endured, after finally starting to believe in safety, his counsel's casual dismissal had destroyed her fragile trust in seconds. Rather than lose his temper in front of Sera, he forced his voice to remain level. "Lady Morgana, we've discussed this. Sera is under my protection now." "Protection, yes." Morgana's smile was sharp as a blade. "But surely temporary protection until proper arrangements can be made. She's not exactly—" Her gaze flicked over Sera dismissively. "Suitable for permanent residence." The way Sera seemed to shrink into herself made something murderous wake in Kieran's chest. His mate, his Luna, whether the council accepted it or not, didn't deserve to be spoken about like she was a problem to be solved. Despite that, he couldn't reveal the bond yet. Not when Sera was still so fragile, still so convinced this was all some elaborate trap. "Lady Morgana," he said quietly, letting just enough alpha dominance leak into his voice to make her step back. "You're dismissed." After the woman left with obvious reluctance, silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sera stared at her hands, and Kieran could practically see her rebuilding the walls he'd spent hours carefully dismantling. "It's not what you think," he said softly. "Isn't it?" Her voice was hollow. "I'm not stupid, Your Majesty. I know what I am, what I'm worth." Truth be told, hearing her call him by his title instead of his name hurt more than he'd expected. They'd taken a step backward, maybe several steps, and he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. "You're worth everything," he said fiercely, "and I'll spend however long it takes proving that to you." Even so, the doubt in her dark eyes told him it would be an uphill battle. Come morning, he would show her exactly how much she meant to him.
The castle felt like a beautiful prison. Sera wandered through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced alphas, each one radiating the kind of power she'd never been allowed to dream of. Servants moved through the space like ghosts, efficient and silent, but their eyes followed her with curiosity and something that looked like pity. She didn't belong here. Every marble pillar and crystal chandelier reminded her of that truth. Next, she found herself in what appeared to be a library, walls lined floor to ceiling with more books than she'd ever seen. The scent of leather and old paper wrapped around her like a hug, stirring memories of her father reading to her when she was small. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Kieran's voice made her jump. She spun around to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with those impossible golden eyes. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly. "I was just exploring." His smile was gentle. "This is your home now, Sera. You can go wherever you want." Your home. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. This place with its impossible luxury and casual grandeur, this was supposed to be home? From there, he began showing her around like she actually mattered. The kitchens where the staff treated her with careful respect. The gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors. The training grounds where warriors practiced with deadly grace. What followed was the strangest afternoon of her life. Everywhere they went, people bowed to Kieran and nodded respectfully to her. Not like she was property or punishment, but like she was someone worthy of acknowledgement. "I don't understand the rules here," she admitted as they walked through a courtyard filled with sculptures. "What rules? How to act, what to say, what you expect from me." The words tumbled out in a rush. "At the compound, the rules were clear. Here, I don't know how to be." Despite that, Kieran stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "The only rule here is that you're free to be yourself, whatever that looks like." Before she could respond, a crash echoed from nearby. Without thinking, Sera flinched and threw her hands up to protect her face. A response so automatic it happened before conscious thought. When nothing happened, she slowly lowered her arms to find Kieran watching her with something that looked like heartbreak. "It was just a servant dropping something," he said quietly. "You're safe here. I promise." But promises, Sera had learned, were just another word for lies waiting to happen.
Watching Sera flinch from shadows was slowly killing Kieran's soul. Every automatic defensive gesture, every moment of confusion when kindness wasn't followed by cruelty, every time she looked at him like she was waiting for the mask to slip, it all painted a picture of just how thoroughly Thorn had broken her. Meanwhile, his wolf paced restlessly, demanding he mark her, claim her, make it impossible for anyone to hurt her ever again. But the human part of him understood that rushing would only drive her away. "Tell me about your father," he said as they settled on a bench overlooking the rose garden. Something flickered in her eyes, pain, but also warmth. "He used to say that strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but how much you could endure and still choose kindness." Sounds like a wise man. He was. Her voice grew soft. "He'd have liked you, I think. He always said the best leaders were the ones who protected their people, not the ones who ruled through fear." As she spoke, Kieran caught glimpses of the woman she'd been before Thorn's brutality. Intelligence, warmth, a spine of steel hidden beneath carefully constructed vulnerability. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. The question seemed to drain all the light from her expression. "Hunting accident. That's what Thorne called it. But—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Truth be told, Kieran already knew the answer. His investigation had uncovered enough evidence to paint a clear picture of murder, but hearing the pain in her voice made his determination to see justice done burn even brighter. "He didn't deserve what happened to him," Kieran said quietly. "Neither did you." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Then the walls slammed back into place, and she was looking at him like a stranger again. Still, progress was progress, and Kieran was nothing if not patient. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in shades of gold and crimson, he made her another promise. "No one will ever hurt you again, Sera. Not while I draw breath." Whether she believed him or not remained to be seen. The training grounds buzzed with morning energy as Kieran led Sera toward the practice rings. Warriors moved through their forms with deadly grace, the sound of steel on steel ringing through the crisp air. This was where he'd learned to fight, to lead, to become the kind of alpha who protected rather than conquered. Now he wanted to teach his mate the same lessons. "I don't understand," Sera said quietly, her hands twisting nervously in the simple training clothes he'd had made for her. "Why would you want me to learn to fight?" Rather than answer immediately, Kieran picked up a practice sword and tested its weight. "Because strength isn't just about physical power. It's about knowing you can defend yourself, knowing you have choices." The way she watched him move, like she expected violence to turn on her at any moment, made his chest ache. But he also caught something else in her gaze. Curiosity, maybe even hunger. Despite that, when he offered her the sword, she stepped back like it might bite her. "I can't," she breathed. "Omegas don't fight. We're not built for it." "Says who?" His voice carried just enough challenge to make her spine straighten. "Thorne? The same male who lied about everything else?" From there, he began with the basics. How to hold a blade without cutting herself, how to stand without telegraphing her intentions, how to move with purpose instead of fear. What followed was the most frustrating and rewarding hour of his life. Sera moved like she was made of glass, terrified of her own potential. But beneath the careful submission, he caught glimpses of natural grace, lightning-quick reflexes, an intuitive understanding of balance and leverage that spoke of untapped potential. "Again," he said after she fumbled another basic form. "I'm not good at this," she muttered, frustration bleeding through her careful control. "You're learning. There's a difference." Meanwhile, something was shifting in her scent. The ever-present undertone of fear was giving way to something sharper, something that smelled like determination. As the morning progressed, her movements became more confident. Not skilled, that would take time, but purposeful, like she was starting to believe she had the right to take up space. That night, as they finished the session, Kieran felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope.
The sword felt alien in Sera's hands, but also strangely right. For 2 years, she'd been taught that her only value lay in her ability to endure pain, to be small, to disappear when necessary. Now Kieran was asking her to be big, to fight back, to claim space in the world. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Focus on your footwork," he instructed, moving behind her to adjust her stance. His hands on her shoulders sent electricity shooting down her spine. "Balance is everything. If you're not grounded, you can't strike effectively." Still, every time she started to find a rhythm, doubt crept in. This wasn't for girls like her. She was built for submission, for suffering, for— "Stop thinking," Kieran said sharply. "Trust your instincts." "My instincts tell me to run," she admitted. "Then we'll teach them something new." Next, he demonstrated a basic defensive sequence, moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of decades of training. Watching him fight was like watching art come to life. Every movement purposeful, every strike calculated for maximum efficiency. When he offered to spar, slowly, carefully, something wild stirred in her chest. Without warning, she found herself moving, not thinking, just reacting. The sword became an extension of her arm, and for one perfect moment, she felt powerful. Then reality crashed back, and she stumbled to a halt. "I can't do this," she gasped. "I'm not—" "You are." His voice was fierce with conviction. "I saw it just then. The warrior you're meant to be." As their eyes met across the practice ring, Sera felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, but blooming, like a flower reaching for sunlight after years in darkness. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could be more than the broken thing Thorn had created. Even so, the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like the beta whispered warnings. Warriors got hurt. Warriors got people killed. Warriors forgot their place and paid the price. But when Kieran smiled at her, proud and warm and completely without expectation, she decided that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop listening to that voice. As they walked back toward the castle, training swords in hand, Sera allowed herself a dangerous thought. What if she could become someone worth saving? 3 weeks into training, Sera finally drew blood. It happened during what should have been a routine sparring session. Marcus, one of Kieran's younger warriors, had been assigned to help with her hand-to-hand combat. He was patient, skilled, and careful not to overwhelm her with his obviously superior strength. What he didn't expect was for her to stop holding back. The switch flipped without warning. One moment she was fumbling through defensive forms. The next, she was moving like water, ducking under his guard and driving her elbow into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over. After that, everything happened in slow motion. Marcus stumbled backward, genuinely surprised. Sera pressed her advantage, muscle memory she didn't know she possessed taking over. Her fist connected with his jaw with a crack that echoed across the training ground. Blood bloomed on his lower lip like a crimson flower. "Sera!" Kieran's voice cut through her battle haze like a blade. Reality crashed back in waves of horror. She'd hurt someone. Actually hurt them. Blood stained her knuckles, someone else's blood, and the metallic scent made her stomach lurch. Next, panic flooded her system. This was what happened when Omegas forgot their place, when they dared to fight back. Violence bred violence, and now— "I'm sorry," she gasped, backing away from Marcus like he might explode. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean—" "Sera, stop." Kieran's hands closed around her shoulders, steady and warm. "Look at me." But she couldn't stop the spiral. Blood, violence, punishment. The inevitable consequences of stepping out of line crashed over her in waves. "He's going to beat me," she whispered. "I hit him, and now he's going to—" "No one is going to beat you." Kieran's voice was fierce, cutting through her panic like sunlight through storm clouds. "You defended yourself. You fought back. That's exactly what I wanted you to learn." Meanwhile, Marcus was grinning despite his split lip. "Nice hit," he said, dabbing at the blood with obvious pride. "Didn't see that coming." The casual acceptance in his voice made Sera's world tilt sideways. Where was the rage? The retaliation? The lesson about knowing her place? From there, the other warriors began gathering around, not to punish her, but to offer congratulations, praise for her technique, suggestions for improvement, like violence from her was expected. Welcome. Normal. "I don't understand," she breathed. "You're learning to fight," Kieran said simply. "Fighting means someone occasionally gets hurt. It's not personal, it's not punishment. It's just training." As the truth of his words sank in, something fundamental shifted in Sera's chest. For the first time in 2 years, violence hadn't led to more violence. Fighting back hadn't brought the sky crashing down, which meant, maybe, she really could become someone worth saving.
Pride blazed in Kieran's chest as he watched Sera process what had just happened. The warrior he'd glimpsed in stolen moments was finally starting to emerge. Not the broken creature Thorne had created, but the fierce woman she'd been born to be. His Luna, finding her claws at last. Truth be told, watching her move in combat was like watching poetry in motion. She had instincts that couldn't be taught. Perfect timing, natural grace, an intuitive understanding of leverage and momentum. Still, the terror in her eyes when she'd realized she'd drawn blood painted a clear picture of just how deeply Thorne's conditioning ran. In her world, violence from an Omega led to devastating consequences. The idea that it could be acceptable, even praised, was foreign to everything she'd learned. "How do you feel?" he asked as the other warriors dispersed. She flexed her fingers, staring at the faint bruising across her knuckles. Strange, powerful, terrified. A pause. Alive. Good. He touched her face gently, thumb tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone. That's exactly how you should feel. Meanwhile, he could see the exact moment when something clicked into place behind her eyes. The realization that she wasn't powerless, that she could fight back, that she had value beyond her ability to endure suffering. "Again," she said suddenly, turning back toward the practice ring with new determination in her voice. As they fell back into training forms, Kieran allowed himself a moment of fierce satisfaction. His mate was finding herself at last. The broken girl was becoming a warrior queen. What followed next would test that newfound strength in ways neither of them could imagine. But for now, watching her discover her own power was enough. Come morning, the real challenges would begin. The War Council chamber felt like a tomb as Kieran stared at the maps spread across the ancient oak table. Red markers dotted the northern borders like drops of blood, each one representing a pack that had declared against his rule. 7 territories, thousands of wolves, all united under one poisonous banner. His decision to claim Sera had made him weak. "The Crimson Ridge Pack has joined the coalition," General Thane reported, his weathered face grim. "That makes it unanimous. Every major territory north of the Broken Hills." Next, Kieran's jaw clenched as he absorbed the implications. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a coordinated assault on everything he'd built, everything his ancestors had died to protect. "What's their stated reason?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Same as the others. You've compromised the bloodline by claiming a broken Omega. They're saying you've lost the strength to lead." From there, the conversation devolved into tactical assessments and casualty projections. Cold numbers that represented very real lives. His people, his responsibility. What followed was the hardest part of leadership, making decisions that would send wolves to their deaths while knowing there was no alternative. "How long do we have?" Kieran asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Thane replied. "They're marshaling forces at Devil's Canyon. When they move, it'll be with everything they've got." Meanwhile, Kieran's thoughts kept drifting to Sera. She was finally starting to heal, to discover her strength, to believe in a future beyond survival. And now he might have to leave her to face this war. As if summoned by his thoughts, a knock echoed through the chamber. Lady Morgana entered without waiting for permission, her expression triumphant in a way that made Kieran's wolf bare its teeth. "Your Majesty," she said with false sweetness, "I've just received word from the coalition. They're prepared to negotiate." "What are their terms?" "Simple." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Return the girl to her proper place, take a suitable mate from one of the allied packs, and all hostilities cease immediately." Silence stretched between them like a canyon. Kieran felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke. Choose your mate or choose your kingdom.
Sera pressed herself against the cold stone wall outside the council chamber, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd only been looking for Kieran to show him the progress she'd made with her sword work. But the sound of raised voices and the word war had frozen her in place. Now she wished she'd never heard any of it. War. Because of her. Because Kieran had chosen to save a broken Omega instead of taking a proper mate, because she'd been selfish enough to accept his protection instead of doing what was right. Rather than feel grateful for his sacrifice, all she felt was crushing guilt. 7 packs, thousands of lives, all because one man had looked at her like she mattered. Simple, return the girl to her proper place. Lady Morgana's words hit her like physical blows. That's what she was to them, a problem to be solved, a weakness to be eliminated. The girl who'd brought war to the Alpha King's door. Despite that, it was the silence after Morgana's ultimatum that broke her heart. The long, heavy pause where Kieran had to weigh her worth against his kingdom's safety. She didn't wait to hear his answer. Next, she fled through the castle corridors like a ghost, her training clothes whispering against stone. Past servants who bowed respectfully, past guards who nodded like she belonged there, past all the beautiful lies that had made her believe she could be something more than payment for her father's crimes. What followed was the longest run of her life, through the gardens, past the training grounds, into the forest beyond the castle walls where pine trees stretched toward a gray sky that matched her mood perfectly. Only when she was alone among the shadows did she finally let herself break. Sera collapsed against an ancient oak and sobbed until her throat was raw. For the dream she'd been foolish enough to believe. For the man who'd shown her kindness only to have it cost him everything. For the girl she'd been before the world taught her that hoping was just another word for bleeding. As the tears finally subsided, one truth crystallized in her mind with painful clarity. She had to leave. Tonight. Before Kieran had to choose between love and duty. Before she destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Sera's wolf had been stirring for hours, pacing beneath her skin like a caged animal. She'd returned to the castle after her breakdown in the forest, determined to pack her few belongings and disappear before Kieran had to make an impossible choice. But every step toward her chambers felt wrong, like swimming against a riptide. That night, sleep refused to come. Instead, she found herself in the castle's highest tower, staring out at a landscape painted silver by moonlight. Somewhere out there, armies were gathering. Wolves were sharpening their claws, all because she'd been too weak to refuse salvation. "You're planning to run." Kieran's voice made her spin around, heart leaping into her throat. He stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, still wearing his council clothes but somehow looking more dangerous than she'd ever seen him. "It's not running," she said quietly. "It's doing what's right." "For who?" His golden eyes blazed in the moonlight. "For the packs who want to see you destroyed? For the wolves who think an Omega doesn't deserve protection?" From there, the argument she'd been dreading finally erupted. His fury at her willingness to sacrifice herself, her desperation to save him from a choice that would destroy him either way. Two people who cared too much, hurting each other in their attempts to heal. "You don't understand," she gasped. "They're right about me. I am broken. I am weak. And staying here will get you killed." "You think I care?" His voice cracked like thunder. "You think I give a damn what they say about strength when you're the strongest person I've ever met?" What followed was the moment that changed everything. Kieran crossed the space between them in 3 strides, his hands framing her face with desperate gentleness. And when he kissed her, fierce and claiming and absolutely certain, something inside Sera's chest exploded. Power. Raw, untamed, ancient power that had been sleeping beneath her broken spirit for 2 long years. Her wolf didn't just stir. It roared to life with a force that shook the castle foundations. Next, the air around them began to shimmer. Golden light poured from her skin like liquid sunshine. The tower windows rattled in their frames as energy rolled off her in waves. "Impossible," Kieran breathed, staring at her like she was a miracle made flesh. Because she wasn't an Omega. Had never been an Omega. As the truth crashed over them both, Sera finally understood why Thorne had worked so hard to break her. Why he'd been so determined to keep her weak and powerless. She was Luna-born, the rarest of the rare. a wolf capable of amplifying her mate's power 100-fold, and her awakening had just announced her presence to every supernatural being within 1,000 miles.
Kieran's world tilted as he watched power pour off his mate like starlight. Lunaborn. The legends he'd heard since childhood suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. The inexplicable pull he'd felt toward her. The way his wolf had recognized her instantly as his other half. The reason Thorn had been so desperate to keep her broken. She wasn't just his mate. She was his equalizer. His other half in ways that went beyond emotion into something cosmic and eternal. Still, the implications hit him like hammer blows. Luna-born wolves were more than rare. They were extinct. The last confirmed case had been over 2 centuries ago. Every pack with even a rumor of Luna blood had been hunted to extinction by those who feared their power. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, his voice rough with wonder and terror in equal measure. Sera stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Golden light still flickered beneath her skin, and the air around her hummed with barely contained energy. "It means I'm even more dangerous than they thought," she whispered. "No." He caught her hands, anchoring her to him, as the power slowly settled. "It means you're exactly what this world needs. What I need." Truth be told, he could already feel the change in himself. His strength, his senses, his connection to every wolf in his territory. Everything was sharper, cleaner, more focused, like someone had removed a veil he hadn't known was there. Meanwhile, the bond between them blazed to life with painful intensity. Not the gentle recognition of compatible mates, but the soul-deep fusion of 2 halves becoming whole. "They'll never stop hunting me now," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "Every pack, every alpha who wants more power. Let them come." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a king who'd never learned to lose. "They'll find out what happens when they threaten my Luna." As if fate demanded it, a howl echoed across the night, followed by another, then another. Not the call of his own wolves, but something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The coalition wasn't waiting for their deadline. They were already here. The first attack came with the dawn. Kieran woke to the sound of the castle's alarm bells and the acrid scent of smoke on the wind. Through his chamber windows, he could see orange flames licking at the sky where the outer defenses should have been. They'd moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Coordinated strikes, multiple fronts, the kind of tactical precision that spoke of months of planning. Next, he was moving before conscious thought kicked in. Armor, weapons, the mental shift from man to war leader that had been trained into him since childhood. "Report," he barked, as General Thane burst into his chambers. 3 separate forces, northern, eastern, and western approaches. They hit the forward posts at exactly the same time. Thane's weathered face was grim. "Professional work. They're not here to negotiate." From there, the conversation became a rapid-fire exchange of tactical assessments, enemy numbers, defensive positions, evacuation routes for the civilians. What followed was the realization that this wasn't just about Sera anymore. The coalition had used her as an excuse, but their real goal was obvious: total conquest of the northern territories. "Where is she?" Kieran asked, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin. "Lady Sera? Safe in the inner keep with the other non-combatants." Meanwhile, every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to verify with his own eyes that his newly awakened mate was protected. But duty demanded he lead from the front, and his people needed to see their alpha standing strong. "Sir?" Thane was watching him with knowing eyes. "The lady will be safe. We've got our best guards on the inner defenses." Still, something felt wrong. The attacks were too coordinated, too precisely timed, like someone had inside information about their defensive strategies. As if summoned by his paranoia, Lady Morgana appeared in the doorway. Her usually perfect composure was cracked, fear bleeding through her political mask. "Your Majesty," she gasped, "there's something you need to know. About the girl." Her words were cut off by an explosion that shook the castle to its foundations. Through the windows, Kieran watched one of the eastern towers collapse in a shower of stone and flame. They were running out of time.
The inner keep felt like a tomb as Sera paced among the other refugees. Children clung to their mothers. Elderly pack members muttered prayers under their breath. Everyone trying to stay calm while the sounds of war echoed through the stone walls like distant thunder. She didn't belong here. Not cowering with the innocents while Kieran fought for everything they'd built together. Not when her awakening had painted a target on everyone she cared about. Rather than accept her helplessness, Sera found herself thinking about the training sessions. The weight of a sword in her hands. The satisfaction of landing a solid hit against an opponent who'd underestimated her. "Lady Sera?" One of the guards approached, his young face tight with concern. "Perhaps you should move deeper into the keep, away from the windows." Before she could respond, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the chamber. Not from outside, from the inner courtyard. Somewhere that should have been safe. That night, the impossible happened. Wolves poured through the keep's supposedly secure entrances like smoke. Not Kieran's wolves. These moved with the disciplined precision of a strike force, and leading them was a face that made Sera's blood freeze in her veins. "Hello, little Omega," Thorne said, his cruel smile exactly as she remembered. "Miss me?" He was supposed to be broken, crippled, left for dead in a cellar hundreds of miles away. But here he stood, moving with predatory grace, very much alive and thirsting for revenge. Next, chaos erupted. Screaming, running, the sound of claws on stone as some of the refugees shifted to defend themselves. What followed was a nightmare of violence and terror as Thorne's wolves cut through the defenders like wheat. These weren't random attackers. They were hunting, looking for one specific target. Her. "Did you really think your king could protect you forever?" Thorne's voice cut through the mayhem like a blade. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for your little rebellion?" As his wolves closed in around her, Sera felt something wild stir in her chest. Not fear, not anymore. Rage, pure, crystalline fury at this monster who refused to let her be free. Truth be told, she was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being the victim in her own story. So when Thorne reached for her with those familiar brutal hands, Sera didn't flinch. She fought back. The golden light that had emerged during her awakening blazed to life beneath her skin. Power, raw and untested but utterly hers, flowed through her like molten metal. And for the first time in her life, Sera Ashwood stood her ground. Power coursed through Sera's veins like liquid lightning as she faced down her tormentor. The golden light pouring from her skin turned the keep's shadows into dancing specters. Every wolf in the chamber, friend and foe alike, dropped to their knees as Luna-born energy crashed over them in waves. "Impossible," Thorne breathed, his cruel confidence cracking like glass. "You're nothing, an Omega, broken." "I was never broken," Sera said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls hum. "I was sleeping." What followed was the most liberating moment of her life. Years of suppressed rage poured out in controlled fury. Not the mindless violence Thorne had shown her, but the righteous anger of someone who'd finally found her strength. Next she struck, not with claws or fangs, but with pure power. Luna energy wrapped around Thorne like chains, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the keep wall with bone-crushing force. "You killed my father," she said, advancing on his crumpled form. "You tortured me for 2 years. You made me believe I was worthless." After that, the real revelation came. "But you knew, didn't you?" Her power pressed against his throat like invisible hands. "You knew what I was from the beginning. That's why you worked so hard to break me. Not because I was payment, because I was a threat." The terror in Thorne's eyes confirmed what she'd already suspected. He'd recognized her Luna blood from the moment her father died, had spent 2 years systematically crushing her spirit to prevent exactly this awakening. From there, Lady Morgana's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Enough! Sera spun to find the elegant woman standing in the doorway. But something was different. Gone was the careful political mask. In its place was something cold and calculating that made Sera's newly awakened instincts scream warnings. "Lady Morgana?" one of the guards gasped. "How did you get past your defenses?" Morgana's smile was sharp as winter. "Simple. I designed them." The betrayal hit the room like a physical blow. Morgana, Kieran's trusted advisor, member of his inner circle, had orchestrated everything. The coordinated attacks, the inside information, the convenient timing that had left Sera vulnerable. Meanwhile, understanding crashed over Sera in waves. "You're working with the coalition." "Working with them?" Morgana laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Child, I am the coalition. Every pack, every alpha who wants to see Kieran fall, they're all dancing to my tune." Still, Sera's power blazed brighter as rage threatened to consume her. This woman had manipulated everything, had probably been feeding information to Kieran's enemies for months, if not years. "Why?" The word tore from her throat like a sob. "Because power belongs to those strong enough to take it," Morgana replied. And Kieran proved his weakness the moment he chose a broken Omega over the stability of his kingdom. Truth be told, hearing herself called broken again should have hurt. Instead, it only fueled the fire burning in her chest. "I'm not broken," Sera said quietly, her voice carrying enough power to make every wolf in the chamber flinch. "And I'm about to show you exactly what a Lunaborn can do when she stops holding back." As golden light exploded from her skin like a miniature sun, Sera finally understood what she was truly capable of. The war had only just begun.
Kieran felt the exact moment his mate's power exploded to life. The bond between them blazed like a star-going nova, and suddenly he could see the battle with perfect clarity. Every enemy position, every weak point in their defenses, every opportunity for victory that had been hidden in chaos. More importantly, he could feel Sera's rage burning like a beacon in the darkness. She was fighting, not running, not hiding, but standing her ground like the warrior queen he'd always known she could become. "Sir?" General Thane was staring at him with something like awe. "Your eyes, they're glowing." Truth be told, Kieran could feel the change in himself. His mate's awakening hadn't just restored her power. It had amplified his own beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Strength flowed through him like molten steel. His senses sharpened until he could track every heartbeat on the battlefield. "New plan," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made every wolf in hearing distance stand straighter. "We end this now." From there, the tide of battle began to turn. What had been a desperate defense became a coordinated assault. His wolves moved with supernatural precision, guided by the tactical clarity flowing through their alpha's bond. Still, even as victory became possible, Kieran's thoughts remained fixed on Sera. She was in danger. He could feel it through their connection like a knife to the chest. "Thane," he barked, "take command. I'm going to the keep." "Sir, the battle is already won." Golden light blazed behind Kieran's eyes as Lunaborn power flowed through him. "My mate needs me." As he raced through the castle corridors, following the pull of their bond like a compass needle, one truth burned in his mind with absolute certainty. Anyone who threatened his Luna would learn exactly why the Blackthorne line had ruled unchallenged for 3 centuries, and why they always would.
Golden fire consumed the keep as Sera's power reached its breaking point. Every stone in the ancient walls hummed with Luna-born energy. The air itself seemed to bend around her as she faced down the woman who'd orchestrated so much suffering. Morgana stood frozen, her political mask finally shattered to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "You think you've won something?" Morgana's voice cracked like thin ice. "You're still nothing but a broken girl playing at being a queen." Rather than flinch at the familiar insult, Sera felt something crystallize in her chest. Not rage, something colder, more dangerous. "Maybe," she said quietly, her voice carrying harmonics that made the keep's windows rattle. But broken things can still cut. What followed was the moment she stopped being a victim forever. Power poured from her in waves, but not the wild, uncontrolled fury of her first awakening. This was precision, focus. 2 years of systematic torture transformed into surgical retribution. Next, Morgana's confident facade crumbled as Luna energy wrapped around her like chains. The elegant woman who'd manipulated kingdoms found herself lifted off her feet, suspended in golden light that burned like miniature suns. "Please," Morgana gasped, terror finally bleeding through her composure. "I was just following orders." "Whose orders?" Sera's power pressed against the traitor's throat like invisible hands. From there, the truth poured out in desperate gasps. Names, locations, the scope of the conspiracy that had been building for years. Not just against Kieran, but against the very idea that an alpha could choose love over political convenience. What followed was the realization that this war had been inevitable from the moment Kieran claimed her. The coalition hadn't been reacting to his choice. They'd been orchestrating it, using her as bait to expose what they saw as fatal weakness. "They're coming," Morgana wheezed. "The real army. Everything you've seen is just the advance force." Before Sera could respond, the keep's main doors exploded inward. Not from enemy attack, from Kieran himself, moving with supernatural speed and trailing golden light like a comet. Their eyes met across the chaos, and the bond between them blazed to life with painful intensity. Not just recognition now, but complete fusion. 2 halves of the same soul finally finding perfect balance. Meanwhile, the power flowing between them reached levels that made the air itself shimmer. Every wolf in the chamber, enemy and ally alike, dropped to their knees as true Luna-born fury filled the space. "Are you hurt?" Kieran's voice carried enough alpha dominance to make stone statues kneel. "No," Sera replied, her own power harmonizing with his until they became something greater than the sum of their parts. "But she's about to be."
Seeing his mate wielding Luna power like a weapon of divine justice was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Kieran had ever witnessed. She stood in the center of the keep like an avenging angel, golden light pouring from her skin in waves. Morgana hung suspended in her grip, terror etched across features that had once radiated political confidence. The traitor who'd orchestrated so much suffering was finally facing consequences. Still, it was the look in Sera's eyes that stopped his breath. Not the broken victim he'd first found, but something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping beneath her careful submission. His Luna, his queen, his equal in every way that mattered. "Tell me what she revealed," he said, moving to stand beside her. The moment their hands touched, power exploded between them like lightning finding ground. The bond he'd felt forming over weeks of careful courtship snapped into place with devastating force. Not just mate recognition, but something deeper. Soul fusion. The kind of connection legends were built around. Truth be told, he could feel everything she felt. The rage at years of manipulation, the satisfaction of finally having power over those who'd hurt her, the bone-deep certainty that she would never be a victim again. "The coalition has a second army," Sera said, her voice steady despite the cosmic forces flowing through her. "Everything we fought was just a test. They wanted to see how our bond would affect our abilities." From there, the tactical implications became clear. They'd been played from the beginning, used as experimental subjects to gauge the true power of a mated Luna pair. What followed was the most important decision of his reign. "Let them come," Kieran said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "They want to see what we're capable of? We'll show them." Meanwhile, Morgana's struggles grew weaker as Sera's power continued to drain her strength. The elegant woman who'd seemed so untouchable was revealed as just another predator who'd finally met something bigger. "Please," the traitor gasped. "I can tell you everything. Names, locations, battle plans." "We don't need your information," Sera said quietly. "We have something better." As their combined power reached levels that made reality itself seem malleable, Kieran finally understood what his mate meant. They had each other, and that was worth more than any army. The formal mating bond blazed to life at sunset, witnessed by the full moon rising over a battlefield painted in victory. Kieran stood in the castle's highest tower, watching his wolves tend to the wounded and secure the defeated coalition forces. The day's fighting had ended in decisive victory, but he knew it was only the beginning. Morgana's revelations had painted a picture of enemies that stretched far beyond these mountains. Still, none of that mattered now. Not with Sera moving toward him across the tower roof, moonlight turning her into something ethereal and eternal. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Truth be told, he'd been ready since the moment he first saw her. But the formal bonding carried weight beyond emotion. Once completed, their souls would be linked until death. Their power would be shared. Their fates would be intertwined in ways that made political marriage look like a children's game. "The question is whether you're ready," he replied, reaching for her hands. "Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be bound to a king who has enemies, a male who might not survive the wars coming." Next, she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. The Luna power that had awakened that morning still flickered beneath the surface, but now it was controlled, purposeful, deadly. "I'm tired of going back," she said simply. "I want to go forward, with you." From there, the ritual began with words as old as the mountains themselves, promises spoken in the ancient tongue, vows that carried the weight of bloodlines stretching back to the first wolves who learned to love as well as hunt. What followed was the most intense experience of Kieran's life. The moment their souls touched, power exploded between them like a star being born. Not just Luna energy or alpha dominance, but something entirely new. Something that had never existed before in the history of their kind. Meanwhile, he could feel everything she felt. Her wonder at the connection. Her fierce protectiveness of what they were building together. Her absolute certainty that she would die before letting anyone hurt him. "Forever," she whispered against his lips as the bond settled into place. "Forever," he agreed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As they stood together under the watchful moon, two souls finally whole, Kieran felt a presence that made every hair on his body stand on end. They were being watched.
The bond sang in Sera's veins like liquid music as she felt the presence pressing against the edges of her consciousness. Power, ancient power that made her newly awakened abilities feel like candle flames next to a forest fire. Something old and vast and utterly inhuman was studying them with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. Rather than fear, she felt only fierce protectiveness. Whatever was out there, it wouldn't touch Kieran. Not while she drew breath. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, not wanting to break the sanctity of their bonding, but needing to know she wasn't imagining the threat. "Yes." Kieran's voice was grim as he scanned the forest beyond the castle walls. "Something's been watching us since the bond completed." From there, the presence seemed to shift, moving closer with predatory grace. Not hiding anymore, announcing itself. Making sure they knew they'd attracted attention from something far more dangerous than any coalition of wolves. What followed was a sound that made Sera's blood freeze in her veins. Not a howl, something deeper, older. The kind of call that spoke of things that had ruled the darkness long before wolves learned to walk upright. "Dragons," Kieran breathed, understanding dawning in his golden eyes. The word hit Sera like a physical blow. Dragons were legend, myth. Stories told to frighten children and explain why certain parts of the mountains were forbidden to all wolfkind. Still, as massive wings blotted out the stars above them, she realized some legends were simply truths waiting to be rediscovered. "They're supposed to be extinct," she gasped. "So were Luna-born wolves," Kieran replied grimly. "Until today." Next, the dragon landed on the tower's battlements with enough force to crack stone. Scales that looked like liquid obsidian, eyes like molten gold, wings that could blot out the sun. Everything about the creature radiated power that made their bond feel like a whisper in a hurricane. What followed was the most terrifying moment of Sera's life. The dragon's massive head swung toward them, ancient intelligence burning in those impossible eyes. When it spoke, the voice resonated in harmonics that made the castle's foundations tremble. "Little wolves," it said, amusement and threat warring in tones like grinding mountains. "You've made so much noise with your mating, did you think we wouldn't notice?" As the true scope of what they'd awakened became clear, Sera realized their war with the coalition had been nothing but a prelude. The real test was just beginning. The dragon's presence pressed against Sera's mind like a weight that threatened to crush her newly awakened consciousness. Ancient. That was the only word that fit. This creature had been old when her grandmother's grandmother was still learning to walk. Power radiated from its obsidian scales in waves that made her Luna abilities feel like sparked flint next to a wildfire. "You know what you are, little Luna," the dragon continued, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her bones. "The question is whether you understand what that means." Rather than cower, Sera found herself stepping forward. The bond with Kieran blazed in her chest, lending her strength she'd never imagined possible. They were mated now. Whole. Whatever this creature wanted, it would have to go through both of them. "Why don't you tell me?" she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. What followed was a laugh that sounded like avalanches in the distance. "Brave. Foolish, but brave. Your mate chose well." From there, the dragon began to pace along the tower's edge, each step sending tremors through stone that had stood for centuries. Predatory grace wrapped in scales and fury, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Lunaborn were created to be our equals," it said, golden eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Partners in the ancient compact, bridges between wolf and dragon, mortal and eternal." The words hit her like revelation. Luna wolves hadn't been accidents of genetics. They'd been engineered, created by dragons to serve as intermediaries between species that were too different to coexist naturally. Still, there was something in the creature's tone that made warning bells clang in her mind. "What compact?" "The one your people broke 3 centuries ago." Now the dragon's voice carried edges that could cut glass. "When they decided wolves were meant to rule instead of serve." Meanwhile, understanding crashed over her in waves. The systematic hunting of Lunaborn wolves. The legends that painted dragons as monsters to be feared rather than respected. The careful rewriting of history to erase any mention of cooperation between species. "The Blackthorne line," she breathed. "They led the rebellion." "Very good." The dragon's smile revealed teeth like swords. "And now a Blackthorne has awakened the first Lunaborn in 3 centuries. Do you think that's coincidence, little wolf?" Next, she felt Kieran tense beside her, his own power rising in response to the implied threat. But when she looked into his golden eyes, she saw understanding there too. This was why his family had always been so powerful, why the Blackthorne alphas had ruled unchallenged for generations. They'd been hoarding dragon power stolen from the ancient compact.
Kieran felt the weight of 3 centuries of family lies crushing down on his shoulders. The dragon spoke truth. He could feel it in his bones, in the way power responded to the creature's presence. His ancestors hadn't just broken an ancient treaty. They'd stolen something sacred and built their dynasty on cosmic theft. Truth be told, he'd always wondered why his bloodline carried such impossible strength. Why Blackthorne alphas could command absolute loyalty from wolves who'd never met them. Why their rule had never been successfully challenged despite dozens of attempts. Now he knew. They'd been living on borrowed power for 300 years. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Justice." The dragon's eyes blazed like molten gold. Restoration of the compact your ancestors shattered. Return of what was stolen. From there, the creature began to circle them like a predator evaluating prey. Each step sent tremors through the ancient stone, reminders of exactly how fragile their defenses really were. The Lunaborn were created to channel our power safely, it continued, to serve as conduits between dragon and wolf. Your ancestors murdered them to prevent us from reclaiming what was ours. Still, something in the dragon's posture suggested this wasn't just about revenge. There was urgency there, desperation even. Why now? Kieran asked. Why reveal yourselves after 3 centuries of hiding? What followed was a moment of silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. When the dragon spoke again, its voice carried notes of something that might have been fear. Because we're dying. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Ancient, immortal dragons. Dying. And somehow, Sera's awakening was connected to their survival. Meanwhile, the pieces began clicking into place. The coalition's timing. The coordinated attacks designed to force Sera's awakening. Morgana's careful manipulation to ensure maximum stress would trigger her Luna transformation. You've been orchestrating this, Sera said, understanding dawning in her voice. The war, the betrayal, everything. You needed me to awaken, so you created circumstances that would force it. Guilty. The dragon's smile was sharp as winter. Though I had help from those who share our goals. As the true scope of the manipulation became clear, Kieran felt rage building in his chest. His mate had been used, tortured, broken, all to serve the agenda of creatures who viewed wolves as expendable tools. What makes you think we'll help you? He snarled, letting alpha dominance leak into his voice. The dragon's laugh could have shattered mountains. Because, little alpha, you don't have a choice. The compact will be restored one way or another. The only question is whether you'll participate willingly. As massive wings spread wide enough to blot out the stars, Kieran realized their real war was just beginning. And this time, the enemy was something that had been planning revenge for 300 years. The dragon's ultimatum hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. 7 days, the creature had said before launching itself into the night sky. Restore the compact willingly, or we'll take what's ours by force. And this time we won't leave any wolves alive to rebel again. Now, as dawn painted the mountains in shades of blood and gold, Kieran stood in his war room surrounded by maps and the weight of impossible choices. Every strategic option led to the same conclusion. His people were no match for creatures that breathed fire and had been planning vengeance for centuries. Still, surrender wasn't in his nature. The Blackthorne line had ruled through strength for generations. Even if that strength had been built on stolen power, it was still real, still his to wield. The coastal territories have agreed to provide sanctuary for non-combatants, General Thane reported, his weathered face grim. But evacuation will take weeks. We don't have that kind of time. From there, the conversation devolved into tactical assessments that all pointed toward the same devastating truth. They could fight. They could die heroically. But they couldn't win. What followed was the hardest realization of his reign. Sometimes being a good king meant accepting defeat to save lives. Sir? Thane was watching him with knowing eyes. There might be another option. Before Kieran could respond, Sera's presence blazed through their bond like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She was coming. And with her, she carried certainty that made his soul sing with recognition. Next, she entered the war room like a queen claiming her throne. Gone was any trace of the broken girl he'd first found. This was Luna-born power, wrapped in flesh and bone, beautiful and terrible, and absolutely his. The dragons aren't lying about dying, she said without preamble. I can feel it through the bond. Something is killing them slowly. Has been for centuries. Meanwhile, understanding began to dawn in Kieran's mind. If the dragons were dying, if their power was fading, then the stolen strength his bloodline had been hoarding might be the only thing keeping them alive. The compact wasn't just about servitude, Sera continued, her eyes blazing with revelation. It was symbiotic. Dragons provided power. Lunaborn channeled it safely. Wolves gained strength. Everyone benefited. Truth be told, the political implications were staggering. If they could restore the compact voluntarily, they wouldn't just be surrendering, they'd be negotiating from a position of mutual need. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "I'm suggesting we give them what they want," she replied firmly. "But on our terms." As the pieces of a desperate plan began forming in his mind, Kieran felt something he hadn't experienced since this crisis began. Hope.
The plan that crystallized in Sera's mind was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. Standing in the war room surrounded by maps and the scent of male desperation, she felt the truth of their situation settle into her bones. The dragons weren't conquerors seeking domination. They were a dying species making one last desperate gambit for survival. Rather than see that as weakness, she recognized it as opportunity. "The compact failed because both sides tried to dominate instead of cooperate," she said, moving to the great map that dominated the room's center. "What if we offered true partnership instead?" From there, she began outlining a vision that would have been impossible before her awakening. Not restoration of the old compact, but creation of something new. Something built on equality rather than servitude. What followed was the most important conversation of her life. Kieran's tactical brilliance combined with her intuitive understanding of power dynamics. Two minds working in perfect harmony to forge a solution that could save both their species. "It could work," General Thane said slowly, his military mind already calculating possibilities. "If the dragons truly need Lunaborn channeling to survive, then you'd be negotiating from strength, not weakness." Still, the risks were enormous. If she was wrong about the dragons' desperation, if they decided negotiation was pointless, if the ancient creatures chose genocide over cooperation, then her plan would doom everyone she cared about. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I felt when the dragon touched my mind. They're not just dying from natural causes. Something is hunting them, something that's been picking them off one by one for centuries." Meanwhile, the implications sent cold fingers down her spine. If something existed that could hunt dragons successfully, then the entire supernatural world was in more danger than anyone realized. "What kind of something?" Kieran asked, his alpha instincts clearly screaming warnings. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it's the reason they need us. The compact isn't just about power, it's about survival against a common enemy." As the true scope of their situation became clear, Sera felt determination crystallize in her chest like steel cooling in water. The dragons wanted partnership? She'd give them partnership. But it would be between equals, with terms that protected her people as much as theirs. Because she might be Lunaborn, but she was also Kieran's mate. And queens didn't kneel. They ruled. The attack came at midnight, when the moon was dark and shadows ruled the world. Sera jolted awake to the sound of screaming, not human screams, but something far more terrible. Dragon cries of agony that shattered windows and made the castle foundations tremble like leaves in a hurricane. Next, she was moving before conscious thought kicked in, the Luna bond with Kieran blazing to life as they both reached the same horrifying conclusion. Something was killing the dragons. Here. Now. While they were supposed to be negotiating terms of survival. "Stay inside," Kieran commanded, already reaching for his weapons. "Whatever's out there is exactly what we need to face together," she finished firmly. The bond between them pulsed with shared determination. "We're stronger united. You know this." From there, they raced through corridors filled with panicking servants and confused guards. No one knew what was happening, only that the very air seemed to vibrate with supernatural fury and something that felt like cosmic wrongness. What followed was their first glimpse of the enemy that had been hunting dragons for centuries. Through the great hall's shattered windows, Sera saw shapes moving in the darkness, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with predatory grace, and wherever they touched, reality itself seemed to fade. "Devourers," whispered an ancient voice behind them. They spun to find the obsidian dragon from the tower crouched in the courtyard, its magnificent scales dulled with pain and something that looked like fear. "What are devourers?" Sera asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. "Creatures from the spaces between worlds," the dragon replied, its voice weak with exhaustion. "They feed on magic itself, on power, on the very essence that makes supernatural beings possible." Meanwhile, understanding crashed over her in waves of horror. The systematic extinction of Luna-born wolves, the dragon's gradual weakening, the way supernatural abilities had been declining across all species for generations. It hadn't been natural evolution or political manipulation. Something had been eating their world's magic, one powerful being at a time.
Kieran's blood turned to ice as he watched the devourers move through his territory like shadows given malevolent purpose. They flowed rather than walked, leaving trails of absolute darkness that made his wolf whine in primordial terror. Wherever they passed, the very air seemed to drain of life. Plants withered, stone cracked. Even the moonlight seemed to dim in their presence. Still, it was the way they hunted that made his tactical mind race with horrifying implications. Coordinated, intelligent, patient. They'd been systematically targeting the most powerful supernatural beings for centuries, weakening the overall magical ecosystem until their prey could no longer resist effectively. "How many of your kind are left?" he asked the wounded dragon. 12, came the devastating reply. "Down from thousands when your ancestors broke the compact." From there, the true scope of the catastrophe became clear. The dragons hadn't been exaggerating about extinction. They were the last remnants of a species that had once ruled the skies, and now the same fate was coming for every other magical creature in existence. What followed was the most important realization of his life. The compact hadn't been about dominance or servitude. It had been about survival. Dragons, wolves, and Luna-born working together because separately, they were all just prey for something infinitely more dangerous. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sera demanded, golden light beginning to flicker beneath her skin as her power responded to the threat. "Would you have believed us?" the dragon asked sadly. "Your people spent 3 centuries convincing themselves we were the enemy. How could we explain that the real enemy was something you couldn't see until it was too late?" Meanwhile, the devourers were getting closer. Kieran could feel them pressing against the castle's defenses like acid eating through steel. Ancient protective wards laid down by his ancestors were failing one by one, unable to withstand entities that existed partially outside reality. "How do we fight them?" he asked, though part of him suspected the answer. "You don't," the dragon replied. "You survive. You run. You hide until they move on to easier prey." Truth be told, that wasn't an option he could accept. His people were here, his territory, his responsibility to protect everything he'd been born to rule. As the first devourer flowed through the castle's outer walls like smoke-given substance, Kieran made the decision that would define the rest of his life. They weren't running, they were fighting, even if it killed them all.
The devourer that entered the great hall moved like liquid nightmare. Sera's newly awakened senses screamed warnings as the creature flowed across stone floors that had stood for centuries. Where it touched, reality seemed to lessen. Colors drained away. Sounds became muffled. Even the air itself felt thinner, like breathing at impossible altitudes. Rather than show fear, she stepped forward, Luna power blazing beneath her skin like captured starlight. The bond with Kieran anchored her, lending strength that made standing against cosmic horror possible. "You've been hunting us," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Picking off the strongest first to weaken the whole." The devourer's response wasn't words. It was a sensation that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her mind. Images of worlds stripped bare of magic. civilizations that had reached for power only to have it consumed by entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts. What followed was understanding that made her soul recoil. The devourers weren't evil in any comprehensible sense. They were hunger given form, appetite made manifest. They consumed magic the way fire consumed wood, not from malice, but from simple, terrible need. "How long?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. More images flooded her mind. Millennia of careful hunting, species after species stripped of power until only the dregs remained. The systematic harvesting of magical worlds until entire dimensions became lifeless husks drifting in cosmic darkness. Next, she saw the truth about her own world. Earth was just the latest hunting ground. The dragons were the last major power source. Once they were consumed, the devourers would finish with the smaller magical beings and move on to fresh prey among the stars. "Not if I stop you," she snarled, letting Luna fire blaze from her skin. From there, the battle began, and immediately went wrong. Her power struck the devourer like sunlight hitting water. For a moment, the creature seemed to pause, almost surprised. Then it began to absorb her energy, growing larger and more solid with each passing second. Meanwhile, horror crashed over her as she realized the truth. Her Luna abilities weren't weapons against these things. They were food. The more power she used, the stronger the devourer became. Which meant every magical being who'd ever tried to fight back had only made their enemy stronger.
Watching his mate's power being consumed like wine poured into sand nearly drove Kieran to his knees. The devourer swelled as it fed, becoming more real, more present, more capable of existing in their reality. What had started as a shadowy threat was rapidly becoming something solid enough to tear the castle apart with physical force. Still, giving up wasn't in his nature. If Luna power only made the creature stronger, then he'd find another way to fight. Tactical thinking, strategic advantage. The skills that had made the Blackthorne line legendary. "Sera, stop!" he commanded, his alpha voice cutting through her battle fury. "You're feeding it!" From there, understanding flashed in her golden eyes. She cut off her power abruptly, leaving them facing a devourer that was now 3 times its original size, and radiating hunger that made reality bend around it. What followed was the most desperate fight of his life. Claws and fangs against something that existed partially outside space and time. Physical strength against cosmic appetite. Mortal determination against inevitable entropy. Meanwhile, more devourers flowed through the castle's defenses like smoke through cracks. Each one was drawn by the magical signatures of everyone inside. Dragon power, Luna energy, alpha dominance. A supernatural buffet that would feed their kind for years. "The vaults," the wounded dragon gasped. "Your ancestors' stolen power. If the devourers reach it..." The implication hit Kieran like a physical blow. Generations of hoarded dragon magic, concentrated in one location. If the devourers found that repository, they'd become strong enough to crack reality itself. Truth be told, they were out of options, out of time, out of hope. As shadows closed in from all sides, Kieran felt the weight of failure crushing down on his shoulders. He'd been born to protect his people. Instead, he'd led them all to slaughter. The last thought that crossed his mind before darkness claimed him was simple and devastating. He'd failed everyone he'd ever loved.
Darkness swallowed the world as Sera watched Kieran fall. The devourer's attack hadn't been physical. It had been something far worse. A draining touch that pulled the very life force from his body, leaving him crumpled on stone floors that had witnessed centuries of Blackthorne victories. Now they would witness the end of that proud bloodline. "No," she whispered, the word tearing from her throat like broken glass. "No, no, no." Rather than accept the inevitable, she crawled toward his motionless form. Her hands shook as she pressed them against his chest, searching desperately for a heartbeat that was growing fainter by the second. "Don't you dare leave me," she snarled, pouring what remained of her Luna power into him. Not now, not like this. From there, the most devastating realization of her life crashed over her in waves. Her power, the abilities that had awakened just days ago, were gone. Not suppressed or hidden, but consumed. Devoured along with everything else that made her special. What followed was the return of every self-doubt she'd thought conquered. Maybe Thorne had been right. Maybe she really was nothing but a broken Omega playing at being a queen. Maybe her brief moment of power had been just another cruel dream designed to make reality hurt worse. Meanwhile, the dragon's pained breathing filled the sudden silence. The magnificent creature that had ruled skies for millennia was dying on her castle floors, its obsidian scales already beginning to fade as devourers fed on its essence. "I'm sorry," the ancient being whispered. "I should have told you sooner, should have warned you what we were really facing." Still, even apologies felt hollow now. Everyone she cared about was dying or dead. The castle that had seemed like sanctuary was becoming a tomb, and she was exactly what she'd always been, powerless to protect anyone from anything. "The compact," she said suddenly, grasping at desperate hope. "If we restored it, too late." The dragon's voice was fading like echoes in a vast cave. "The devourers have fed too much, grown too strong. Nothing can stop them now." Next, she felt the exact moment when Kieran's heart stopped beating. The bond between them, that golden connection that had made her feel whole for the first time in her life, snapped like a rope under impossible tension. Pain beyond description tore through her chest, leaving a void that felt like falling through endless darkness. Truth be told, she'd never understood what people meant when they said heartbreak was a physical sensation. Now she knew. It felt like dying while being forced to stay alive, like breathing when there was no air left in the world. As the devourers closed in from all sides, their hunger radiating like heat from a forge, Sera made peace with the inevitable. She'd had 3 beautiful days of believing she mattered, of thinking she could be more than a victim, of imagining a future where love conquered everything that tried to destroy it. It had been worth dying for.
Death felt like drowning in cold honey. Kieran's consciousness floated in darkness so complete it had weight and texture. No sight, no sound, no sensation except the gradual fading of everything that had once defined him as a living being. Still, somehow he could feel Sera's presence, not through their bond that had shattered when his heart stopped, but through something deeper, more fundamental, like 2 souls recognizing each other across the vast emptiness between life and whatever came after. "Fight," he tried to tell her, though he had no voice in this place. "Don't give up. Don't let them win." From there, memory became his only refuge. Golden moments from their brief time together. The first night he'd seen her in the garden, surrounded by herbs and moonlight. The moment she'd found her strength in the training yard. The way she'd looked at him when the Luna bond finally snapped into place. What followed was the crushing realization that those memories were all he'd ever have. No future. No growing old together. No children who'd inherit her fierce spirit and his stubborn determination to protect what he loved. Meanwhile, he could sense the exact moment when hope died in her eyes. When she stopped fighting and accepted that their story would end in darkness and loss. The knowledge that his death had broken something essential in her spirit hurt worse than his own demise. Truth be told, he'd failed at the one thing that mattered most. Not ruling. Not conquest. Not political legacy. He'd failed to keep his mate safe. And now she would die believing herself worthless again. As consciousness faded to nothing, Kieran held on to one last desperate thought. Somewhere in the vast cosmos, there had to be something stronger than entropy. Something that cared more about love than hunger. Something that would give them one final chance to rewrite an ending that felt carved in inevitability. But hoping for miracles, he'd learned, was just another way of preparing for disappointment. The darkness claimed him completely. And in the castle above, Sera faced the end of everything alone.
Sera cradled Kieran's lifeless body as the world ended around her. The devourers had filled the great hall like smoke-given substance, their presence draining color and warmth from everything they touched. Ancient tapestries crumbled to dust. Stone pillars that had stood for centuries began to crack. Even the air itself felt thinner, harder to breathe. Still, she couldn't make herself let go of him. Her hands traced the sharp line of his jaw, the strong column of his throat where no pulse would ever beat again. 3 days. They'd had 3 perfect days of believing love could conquer anything. "I should have been stronger," she whispered against his cooling skin. "Should have found a way to save you." From there, the familiar voices began their cruel chorus, the same whispers that had haunted her since childhood, louder now in the face of ultimate failure. Worthless. Broken. Nothing but a burden who brought death to everyone who cared about her. What followed was the complete collapse of every wall she'd built against self-hatred. The warrior queen who'd emerged during her awakening crumbled like paper in rain, leaving behind the scared girl who'd always known she didn't deserve saving. Meanwhile, the wounded dragon's breathing grew more labored. The magnificent creature that had ruled skies since the dawn of time was dying on cold stone, its power being slowly drained by entities that existed in the spaces between nightmares. "I'm sorry," she told the ancient being. "This is my fault. If I'd been stronger, if I'd understood sooner—" "Child." The dragon's voice was barely a whisper now. "You were magnificent, both of you. It's this world that failed you." Next, understanding hit her like a physical blow. She'd been thinking about this all wrong. The devourers weren't invincible forces of nature. They were parasites, entities that could only consume what already existed, never create anything new. Which meant there might be one option left. One terrible, final option that would cost everything but might give their world a chance to survive. "The bond," she breathed, realization dawning like sunrise after the longest night. Luna-born were created to channel dragon power safely. What if I channeled all of it? Truth be told, the dragon's eyes widened with something that might have been hope or horror. The process would destroy you. No mortal vessel could contain that much power and survive. But it would work? The combined power of all remaining dragons channeled through Luna abilities. Would it be enough to drive them back? As silence stretched between them, Sera felt certainty crystallize in her chest like steel cooling in water. She couldn't save Kieran, couldn't undo the damage that had already been done, but she could make sure his death meant something. She could save everyone else. "Do it," she said firmly, "before I lose my nerve." The dragon's massive head lifted slightly, ancient intelligence burning in eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Are you certain? There will be no coming back from this. No second chances." Looking down at Kieran's peaceful face, Sera felt tears she didn't know she still had left burning behind her eyes. "I'm certain," she whispered. "Just make it quick." As the ritual began, as dragon power flowed into her mortal frame like molten metal poured into a fragile vessel, Sera's last coherent thought was simple and devastating. At least now she'd finally be strong enough to protect the people she loved, even if it cost her everything. Power tore through Sera's body like liquid lightning, threatening to burn her alive from the inside out. Dragon essence, ancient, vast, and utterly inhuman, poured into her mortal frame faster than her Luna abilities could safely channel it. Every cell screamed in protest as forces meant to be contained in creatures the size of mountains compressed into her small human form. Still, she held on, gritted her teeth and endured because the alternative was watching everyone she'd ever cared about be devoured by cosmic hunger. "I can't," she gasped, feeling her bones begin to crack under the pressure. "It's too much." "You can," the dying dragon whispered, its voice growing fainter with each word it gave to sustain her. "You were born for this, Luna child, born to bridge impossible gaps." From there, something extraordinary happened. Instead of burning away her humanity, the dragon power began to transform it. Her wolf, silent for so long, beaten into submission by years of systematic abuse, suddenly roared to life with supernatural force. What followed was the most profound awakening of her life. Not just the return of her animal nature, but evolution into something entirely new. Her wolf and her human consciousness fused completely, creating a being that was simultaneously mortal and eternal, earthbound and cosmic. Meanwhile, the power flowing through her began to stabilize, no longer the destructive torrent that threatened to tear her apart, but a controlled river of energy that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. "I can see them," she breathed, golden light pouring from her skin as her perception expanded beyond normal reality. "The Devourers? I can see what they really are." Next, understanding flooded her transformed consciousness. The creatures weren't just feeding on magical energy, they were feeding on connection itself. The bonds between mates, the loyalty between pack members, the love that tied communities together. They consumed relationships and left behind nothing but emptiness and isolation, which meant the key to fighting them wasn't raw power. It was the strength that came from refusing to face them alone. Truth be told, she couldn't bring Kieran back from death, but she could reach across the void that separated them and reclaim the bond they'd forged in life. As her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of mortality, Sera called out to the soul of the man she loved and felt him answer.
The voice that called to Kieran across the darkness burned like a star being born. "Come back," Sera whispered, her words carrying power that made the space between life and death tremble. "I need you. The world needs you. We're not finished yet." From there, choice crystallized in the void where his consciousness had been drifting. Death was peaceful, final, an end to responsibility and pain and the crushing weight of leadership. But Sera was offering something else, not resurrection. That would require power even dragons didn't possess. Something deeper, more fundamental. What followed was understanding that defied everything he'd ever believed about life and death. The bond between true mates didn't end when hearts stopped beating. It transcended mortality, reaching into spaces that existed beyond time and flesh. "The pack," he managed, though he wasn't sure how he was speaking without breath or vocal cords. "Are they alive?" she assured him, her presence blazing like sunlight in the cosmic darkness, hiding in the deep vaults while the Devourers feed above. "But they won't stay safe long. I need your tactical mind, your leadership, your stubborn refusal to accept defeat." Meanwhile, he could feel what she was offering. Not life as he'd known it, but existence as something new. A fusion of souls that would let them face their enemies as a unified force. It might not work, he warned, even as he reached for the connection she offered. "We might just be postponing the inevitable." "Maybe," she agreed, "but I'd rather die fighting beside you than live knowing I didn't try everything." As their souls touched across the boundary between worlds, Kieran felt power flow through him like molten gold. Not his own strength returning, but something greater. The combined will of every wolf who'd ever refused to surrender. Every dragon who'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Every Lunaborn who'd died protecting what they loved. Truth be told, they were no longer just Sera and Kieran. They were every mated pair who'd ever stood together against impossible odds, every bond that had refused to break even when death tried to sever it. "Together?" he asked, golden light beginning to gather around his spirit like armor forged from starfire. "Forever," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her transformed being. As they rose from death and transcendence to face their enemies one final time, Kieran felt certainty settle into his bones like steel. The Devourers had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that consuming individual power would be enough to break the connections that made their prey strong. They were about to learn just how wrong they'd been.
Reality reassembled itself around Sera like pieces of a shattered mirror finding their proper places. She stood in the great hall that had been transformed into a battlefield, but now she could see it with perception that transcended normal senses. The Devourers hadn't destroyed everything. They'd simply been feeding so efficiently that most people couldn't perceive what remained. Next to her, Kieran's form flickered between solid flesh and golden light. Death had changed him, transformed him into something that existed partially outside normal reality. But his tactical mind was sharper than ever, already analyzing their situation with supernatural clarity. "The pack," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple dimensions. "I can feel them in the deep vaults, frightened but alive." From there, their expanded awareness painted a picture of their remaining resources. 12 wounded dragons scattered throughout the territory, perhaps 300 wolves hiding in various sanctuaries, and the two of them, transformed, empowered, but still facing enemies that had been systematically consuming magical worlds for millennia. What followed was the most important tactical discussion of either of their lives. Not just planning for battle, but designing a strategy that could work across multiple layers of reality. "The Devourers feed on isolation," Sera said, golden energy flowing around her like liquid starlight. "They consume the connections between people, leaving individuals helpless. But what if we did the opposite?" Meanwhile, understanding began to dawn in Kieran's transformed consciousness. Instead of fighting the creatures directly, they could strengthen every bond, every relationship, every connection that tied their people together. "A network," he breathed. "Not just pack bonds, but something larger. Every supernatural being in the territory linked together." "Exactly." Power pulsed through her voice as the plan crystallized. "If the Devourers feed on connection, we'll give them so much they can't process it all. Overload them with the very thing they're trying to consume." Still, the risks were enormous. Creating a network that large would require every wolf, every dragon, every magical being to open themselves completely. No barriers, no protection, total vulnerability in exchange for unified strength. "It could backfire spectacularly," Kieran warned, "if the Devourers adapt faster than we expect." "Then we die together instead of alone," she interrupted firmly. "But at least we'll die as ourselves, not as empty husks drained of everything that makes us who we are." Truth be told, there was beauty in the simplicity of it. The creatures that fed on isolation would face the most connected community in supernatural history, bonds so numerous and strong that consuming them all would be like trying to drink an ocean through a straw. "How long do we have?" Kieran asked, his enhanced senses already tracking the Devourers' movements through the castle. "Not long," she admitted. "They're spreading out, searching for the power sources they haven't consumed yet. Once they find the vaults..." Next, a new voice cut through their planning session like a blade. "They won't find the vaults," the wounded dragon said, lifting its massive head with obvious effort, "because we're going to give them something much more tempting to hunt." As understanding dawned, Sera felt her transformed heart skip a beat. The dragon was suggesting they use themselves as bait. Draw all the Devourers to one location where the network could be activated with maximum effect. It was brilliant, suicidal, and absolutely their only chance.
The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming session was either the most tactically sound strategy he'd ever devised or the most elaborate form of suicide ever attempted. Kieran's enhanced awareness tracked every variable as they refined the details. Timing, positioning, the precise moment when maximum Devourer concentration would give them the best chance of overwhelming their enemy's ability to process the network they were creating. "The bloodline vaults," he said, his consciousness expanding to encompass the deep chambers where generations of Blackthorne power had been stored. "If we channel all of it through the network simultaneously, it'll either save everyone or kill everyone," Sera finished. "No middle ground." From there, they began reaching out to every supernatural being within their territory, not through voice or physical messenger, but through the transformed bond that now connected them to every living creature touched by magic. What followed was the most profound experience of Kieran's existence. Consciousness after consciousness opened to their call, frightened wolves emerging from hiding, wounded dragons lifting their heads with renewed hope, Even smaller magical beings, sprites, elementals, creatures of forest and stream, adding their voices to the growing chorus. Meanwhile, he could feel the devourers responding to the sudden surge of organized resistance. The creatures moved with increased urgency, their hunger sharpening as they sensed their prey beginning to coordinate. "They know what we're doing," he warned, tracking multiple devourer signatures converging on their location. "Good," Sera replied, power blazing beneath her skin like captured lightning. "Let them come. Let them think they're about to feast on the largest concentration of magical energy they've ever encountered." Still, doubt whispered in the back of his transformed mind. They were gambling everything on an untested theory, betting thousands of lives on the hope that connection could triumph over consumption. "What if we're wrong?" he asked quietly. "What if the network just makes it easier for them to drain everyone at once?" Truth be told, Sera's smile was both terrifying and beautiful in its absolute certainty. "Then we'll face the end knowing we tried everything, that we chose love over fear, unity over isolation, hope over despair." As the first devourers began flowing through the great hall's shattered doors, Kieran felt the network snap into place around them like a web of golden light. Every bond, every relationship, every connection that made their community more than just a collection of individuals blazed to life simultaneously. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time since this nightmare started, he actually believed they might win. The network blazed to life with enough power to crack reality itself. Kieran felt every connection simultaneously. Pack bonds, family ties, friendships forged in battle, love that transcended species barriers, hundreds of relationships flowing together into something greater than the sum of their parts. Through the golden web of light, he could perceive every supernatural being in their territory. Dragons spreading their wings in caverns deep beneath the mountains. Wolves emerging from hidden sanctuaries with renewed courage blazing in their eyes. Even the smallest forest spirits adding their voices to the growing chorus of unified resistance. "They're coming," Sera warned, her transformed senses tracking multiple devourer signatures converging on their location like arrows fired at a single target. From there, the final race began. Not just against the creatures flowing through their defenses, but against time itself. The network was unstable. Too much power flowing through connections that hadn't been designed to handle this kind of cosmic force. What followed was the most desperate coordination effort in supernatural history. Dragons lending their ancient strength to reinforce wolfpack bonds. Luna power flowing through Kieran's royal bloodline to strengthen the network's foundation. Every magical being in the territory pouring their essence into a communal reservoir of unified will. Meanwhile, the devourers poured into the great hall like smoke given malevolent purpose, more than he'd ever seen in one place. Dozens of the creatures drawn by the massive concentration of power blazing before them. "Now," Sera commanded, her voice carrying across every connection in the network. Next, something extraordinary happened. Instead of fleeing or fighting individually, every supernatural being in their territory acted as one organism. Dragons breathed coordinated fire that painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Wolves howled in perfect harmony, their voices carrying power that made the mountains themselves tremble. Even the forest spirits wove barriers of living wood and stone that channeled the devourers toward a single killing ground. Still, it wasn't enough. The creatures adapted too quickly, their hunger growing stronger as they began feeding on the network itself. What had been designed to overwhelm them was becoming the largest feast they'd ever encountered. "They're draining the network faster than we can reinforce it," Kieran warned, feeling the golden connections beginning to flicker and fade. Truth be told, they were running out of time, out of power, out of options except the one they'd been saving for last. "The bloodline vaults," Sera said, her eyes meeting his across the chaos of battle. "All of it. Every scrap of power your ancestors stole from the dragons. We channel it all through the network at once." The implication hung between them like a blade poised to fall. That much power flowing through mortal vessels would destroy them completely. Not transformation this time. Obliteration. The kind of death that left nothing behind but empty space where souls used to be. "Are you ready?" he asked, though the question felt inadequate for what they were about to attempt. "I've been ready since the moment I met you," she replied. And he felt the absolute truth of those words resonate through every fiber of their shared being. As they reached for the locked vaults where centuries of stolen dragon power waited to be reclaimed, Kieran made peace with what was coming. They would save their people. Their sacrifice would give everyone they loved a chance to build something better. It was enough.
The moment Sera opened the bloodline vaults, power older than civilization poured through her transformed consciousness like molten stars. Centuries of stolen dragon essence, hoarded by the Blackthorne line and never properly used, blazed to life with supernatural fury. Through her Luna abilities, she could feel the raw potential of it, enough energy to reshape reality, to rewrite the laws that governed magic itself, but also enough to burn away every trace of her existence in the space between heartbeats. "I can feel them," she gasped, her perception expanding beyond normal reality as the ancient power flowed through her. Every dragon that was murdered for this energy. They're still here, still fighting. From there, something impossible happened. The stolen power didn't just flow through the network. It began calling to its original owners. Dragon spirits that had been trapped in Blackthorne vaults for generations suddenly found themselves free to rejoin the battle. What followed was the most beautiful and terrifying sight either of them had ever witnessed. Ghostly dragons materialized throughout the Great Hall, their spectral forms blazing with righteous fury. Not just the 12 wounded survivors, but dozens of their ancestors returned from whatever realm death had claimed them. Meanwhile, the Devourers found themselves facing something they'd never encountered before, prey that grew stronger instead of weaker when consumed. Every connection they tried to drain was immediately reinforced by dragon power that existed partially outside their reality. "It's working," Kieran breathed, his own consciousness expanding as stolen alpha dominance flowed back to its rightful place in the cosmic order. Still, Sera could feel the cost mounting with each passing second. The human parts of her were burning away like paper in a furnace. Soon there would be nothing left but pure energy, consciousness without form, love without flesh to contain it. "I'm losing myself," she admitted, terror and wonder warring in her voice. "I can feel my boundaries dissolving." Next, Kieran's presence blazed through their bond like an anchor in cosmic storm. "Then hold on to me. Let me be your foundation while you become something greater." Truth be told, it should have been impossible. Mortal consciousness wasn't designed to contain the kind of power flowing through her. But love, apparently, made impossible things routine. As she felt herself beginning to transcend the boundaries of individual existence, Sera made one final choice. Instead of fighting the transformation, she embraced it completely. Let herself become the bridge between mortal and eternal that Luna-born had always been meant to be. "Together," she whispered, reaching for Kieran across spaces that existed beyond normal reality. "Forever," he replied, his own consciousness expanding to merge with hers in ways that made their original mate bond seem like a whisper compared to a symphony. As their unified will focused on the network blazing around them, Sera felt certainty settle into what remained of her individual awareness. The Devourers had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that consuming power would be enough to break the bonds that held their prey together. They were about to learn that some connections transcended even death and transformation.
The moment Kieran's consciousness merged completely with Sera's, the universe rearranged itself around them. No longer two separate beings linked by bond and circumstance, they became something entirely new. A fusion of mortal determination and cosmic power that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Through their expanded awareness, they could perceive reality from perspectives that spanned galaxies and dimensions. More importantly, they could see the Devourers for what they truly were. Not monsters, but refugees. creatures from a dying reality who'd been consuming magical worlds in a desperate attempt to find enough power to save their own realm. They're not evil, Sera's voice echoed through their shared consciousness. They're just hungry and lost, and so far from home they've forgotten what home feels like. From there, understanding bloomed between them like flowers opening to impossible sunlight. The war between magical beings and devourers hadn't been about good versus evil. It had been about two groups of survivors fighting over limited resources. What followed was the most profound choice either of them had ever made. Not to destroy their enemies, but to share their power with them, to offer the devourers what they'd been searching for across countless worlds, enough energy to return to their own reality and repair the damage that had driven them to become cosmic nomads. It'll use everything, Kieran warned, though part of him already knew it was the right choice. Every scrap of power in the network. We won't have anything left to protect ourselves if this doesn't work. Then we'd better make sure it works, Sera replied, her certainty blazing through their connection like sunlight after the longest night. Meanwhile, the network around them began to shift. Instead of a weapon designed to overwhelm their enemies, it became an offering. Power freely given rather than hoarded. Connection offered to beings who'd forgotten what genuine community felt like. Go home, their unified voice carried across dimensions as the stolen dragon power flowed toward the devourers like a river finding the sea. Take what you need and go home. Find peace in your own reality instead of consuming others. Truth be told, the moment stretched like eternity as cosmic forces larger than solar systems hung in perfect balance. Either their gamble would succeed, or it would fail so spectacularly that every magical being in existence would pay the price. Then, impossibly, the devourers began to change. Fed properly for the first time in eons, their hunger started to transform into something else. Gratitude, recognition, the kind of understanding that bridged gaps between species that had evolved in different universes. As the last of the ancient power flowed out of their transformed consciousness, as the network blazed one final time before settling into peaceful darkness, Kieran felt something he'd never expected to experience again. Hope. The war was ending, not in victory or defeat, but in understanding. And somehow, against all odds, they were still alive to see it.
Peace descended on the world like snow settling on winter mountains. Sera's consciousness slowly reassembled itself from the cosmic forces that had scattered her across multiple dimensions. The transformation back to individual awareness felt strange after experiencing unity with everything that existed, but also deeply right. Like coming home after a journey that had lasted lifetimes. Around her, the great hall sparkled with residual magic from the network that had changed everything. Golden light still flickered in the air like captured starlight, and she could feel the lingering presence of every connection they'd forged in the battle against entropy. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice sounding oddly normal after speaking with cosmic harmonics. From there, understanding flowed through her, gradually returning senses. The devourers were gone, not destroyed, but transformed. Fed properly for the first time in eons, they'd remembered what it felt like to be something other than endless hunger. The last she'd sensed of them, they'd been traveling back to their own reality, carrying enough power to heal whatever damage had driven them to become cosmic nomads. What followed was the most profound silence she'd ever experienced, not empty quiet, but the kind of peace that came after impossible storms finally passed. The castle around them hummed with renewed life. Outside, she could hear voices, her people emerging from hiding, dragons spreading wings in celebration, the sound of a world that had remembered how to hope. Meanwhile, Kieran's presence blazed through their bond like warmth returning to frozen limbs, not the desperate fusion of their final battle, but the comfortable connection of two souls who'd found their way back to each other after transcending the boundaries of individual existence. "We did it," he said, wonder coloring his voice as he took in the transformed hall around them. "We actually did it?" Still, victory felt different than she'd expected. Not the triumphant conquest of good over evil, but something quieter. more complex. The satisfaction of choosing understanding over destruction, even when destruction would have been easier. "The dragons," she said suddenly, awareness expanding to encompass the magnificent creatures emerging from their hiding places throughout the territory. "The power we return to them has healed wounds that have festered for centuries," completed a familiar voice. They turned to find the obsidian dragon approaching, but transformed. Where before it had been wounded and fading, now it blazed with renewed vitality. Ancient scars had healed. Dulled scales gleamed like liquid starlight. The creature radiated power that felt both familiar and entirely new. Truth be told, seeing the dragon restored felt like watching a masterpiece emerge from beneath layers of grime and neglect.
Kieran's enhanced perception painted a picture of transformation that stretched far beyond their immediate surroundings. Throughout his territory, he could feel the ripple effects of what they'd accomplished. Not just the defeat of the Devourers, but the healing of rifts that had divided supernatural communities for generations. Dragons and wolves working together to rebuild damaged settlements. Luna-born abilities awakening in bloodlines that had thought them lost forever. Ancient grudges dissolving in the face of shared purpose. More importantly, he could sense the fundamental change in how magic itself flowed through their world. No longer hoarded by individual bloodlines or species, but shared freely among all who needed it. The network they'd created hadn't just been a weapon, it had become a new way of existing. "The compact," he said, understanding dawning as he watched dragons and wolves coordinate their efforts with supernatural efficiency. "We didn't just restore it, we evolved it." From there, the transformed dragon began to explain what their sacrifice had truly accomplished. The original compact had been based on hierarchy, dragons ruling, Luna-born serving as intermediaries, wolves following orders. What they'd created was something entirely different. True partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. What followed was perhaps the most important conversation in supernatural history. Not about conquest or submission, but about building something better. A civilization where power served connection, rather than the other way around. "There will be challenges," the dragon warned, though its tone carried hope rather than concern. "Change always brings uncertainty. Some will resist what we've built here." Meanwhile, Kieran found himself thinking about the future in ways that would have been impossible just days ago. Not as an alpha whose strength depended on others' weakness, but as a leader whose power came from lifting others up. "Let them come," he said firmly. "We'll show them what's possible when different species choose cooperation over conquest." Still, it was Sera's hand slipping into his that made the future feel real, rather than just hopeful theory. The bond between them had survived death, transformation, and forces that existed beyond normal reality. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. "So what now?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of contentment that came from finally knowing your place in the world. Truth be told, Kieran's answer surprised even him. Not grand plans for expansion or political maneuvering, but something much simpler. "Now we live," he said. "We build. We love. We show everyone that happy endings are possible if you're willing to fight for them." As the first rays of dawn painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Kieran felt certainty settle into his bones like foundation stones. They'd saved more than just their world. They'd proven that love really could conquer anything, even entropy itself.
The ceremony took place under the full moon, witnessed by representatives from every supernatural community within 1,000 miles. Sera stood in the center of the ancient stone circle that had once hosted Blackthorne coronations. But this time, the ritual was different. Not the claiming of power, but the sharing of it. The formal establishment of what would come to be known as the New Compact, an agreement between species that had spent centuries viewing each other as threats. "Do you, Sera Ashwood, Luna-born daughter of Alpha Aldrich, accept the responsibility of bridging worlds that were never meant to remain separate?" The words carried weight that seemed to bend reality around them. Not just a political ceremony, but a cosmic realignment that would reshape how magic flowed through their world for generations to come. "I do," she replied, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with supernatural clarity. From there, the dragon elders stepped forward, 12 magnificent creatures representing bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of time. Each one bore scars from the centuries of conflict, but also hope that blazed like captured starlight. What followed was the most beautiful sight she'd ever witnessed. Dragons and wolves intermingling without fear or dominance. Luna-born wolves emerging from bloodlines that had hidden their nature for generations. Even smaller magical beings, sprites, elementals, forest guardians, adding their voices to the growing chorus of unity. Meanwhile, Kieran stood beside her as an equal partner rather than a dominant alpha. The transformation in him over the past weeks was profound, from a king who ruled through strength to a leader who guided through wisdom. The stolen dragon power flowing back to its rightful owners had changed him in ways that went beyond magic into something fundamentally character-deep. "The old compact was based on hierarchy," the obsidian dragon announced, its voice carrying to every corner of the assembled crowd. "Dragon dominance, wolf submission, Luna born as tools rather than partners. That age ends tonight." Next, Sera felt the moment when everything changed. Not gradually, but all at once, like a switch being thrown that illuminated a world that had been hidden in darkness. Magic began flowing freely between species. Ancient barriers dissolved. Wounds that had festered for centuries started to heal. The new compact recognizes no rulers, no subjects, no hierarchy based on species or power level, she said, her words becoming law as she spoke them. Only partners working together toward common goals. Still, it was the moment when Kieran stepped forward that made the transformation feel complete. Not as an alpha claiming dominance, but as a male offering everything he had in service of something greater than himself. "I pledge the Blackthorne line to this compact," he said formally. "Not as rulers, but as protectors. Not as masters, but as servants of the greater good." Truth be told, watching centuries of tradition transform in real time felt like witnessing the birth of stars.
The crown felt different when Kieran placed it on Sera's head. Not the traditional circlet of Blackthorne rule, that had been melted down and reforged into something new. The Luna crown was wrought from metals that had never existed in nature, created through the fusion of dragonfire and wolf determination. It caught moonlight like captured dreams and radiated power that belonged to no single species. "Queen Sera Ashwood Blackthorne," he said formally, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "First Luna sovereign of the United Territories." From there, the celebration began in earnest. Not the stiff political theater he'd grown up with, but genuine joy that blazed like wildfire through the assembled crowd. Dragons performed aerial displays that painted the sky in impossible colors. Wolves howled harmonies that made the mountains themselves seem to sing. Even the smallest magical beings joined the revelry, their laughter tinkling like silver bells in the night air. What followed was perhaps the most important realization of his life. This wasn't about him anymore. Wasn't about the Blackthorne legacy or maintaining traditional power structures. This was about building something better, something that would outlast them all. Meanwhile, he could feel the changes rippling outward through connections that stretched across continents. Other territories were already sending envoys, curious about this new form of government that seemed to make everyone stronger rather than elevating a chosen few. "No regrets?" Sera asked quietly, stepping close enough that her warmth chased away the mountain chill. "About giving up absolute power to create something better?" He smiled, the expression feeling more natural than it had in years. None whatsoever. Still, there was something he needed to say. Something that had been building in his chest since the moment she'd agreed to wear the crown. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're Luna-born, or because our bond makes me stronger. I love you because you're brave enough to choose hope when despair would be easier. Because you see the best in people even when they can't see it themselves. Because you make me want to be worthy of the faith you have in me." Truth be told, her smile in response was worth more than any crown or title or political alliance. "I love you too," she replied. "Forever and always, through whatever comes next." As they stood together under the watchful stars, surrounded by a community they'd helped build from the ashes of ancient conflicts, Kieran felt something he'd never expected to experience: complete and perfect contentment with exactly where his life had led him.
6 months later, the castle that had once been a monument to single-species dominance had transformed into something unprecedented in supernatural history. Sera walked through corridors where dragon younglings played with wolf pups under the watchful eyes of Luna-born guardians who belonged to both species and neither. The sight still made her heart swell with wonder, children growing up without the prejudices that had shaped their parents' lives. The Western Territories have formally requested membership in the United Territories, Kieran reported, joining her in the garden where they'd held their first real conversation. That makes 15 new member states in the past month. From there, they discussed the practical challenges of rapid expansion. How to maintain the principles of the new compact while governing territories that spanned continents. How to prevent the kind of bureaucratic bloat that had made previous supernatural governments collapse under their own weight. What followed was the kind of comfortable partnership that had evolved between them, not the dramatic passion of their early days, but something deeper. The quiet satisfaction of two people building something meaningful together. Meanwhile, changes continued rippling outward in ways they'd never anticipated. Reports filtered in daily about Luna-born abilities awakening in bloodlines that had thought them extinct. Dragon-wolf partnerships forming in territories that had never seen such cooperation. Ancient grudges dissolving as communities discovered the practical benefits of unity over isolation. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real," she admitted, watching a young dragon and wolf practice coordinated flying techniques in the courtyard below. "The transformation? All of it." She gestured at the thriving community around them. 6 months ago, I was property, payment for my father's crimes. Now, still, the weight of leadership sat differently on her shoulders than she'd expected. Not the crushing burden of impossible responsibility, but the comfortable certainty that came from knowing her efforts were making the world better for everyone in it. "Now, you're exactly who you were always meant to be," Kieran said softly. The girl who survived 2 years of systematic brutality and still chose to save her tormentors rather than destroy them. The woman who looked at cosmic entropy and decided love was a stronger force. Next, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention. Not danger. They would have felt that through the security network that now protected their territory. But excitement. The kind of joyful chaos that usually meant good news. Truth be told, the sight that greeted them made Sera's breath catch in her throat. A delegation of young supernatural beings from newly integrated territories arriving to study at the academy they'd established. Future leaders learning to govern through cooperation rather than dominance. "Ready for the afternoon council session?" Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Always," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. As they made their way toward the great hall that had once witnessed her near-death and now hosted daily sessions of collaborative governance, Sera felt profound gratitude for the path that had led her here. She'd thought her story was about surviving abuse and finding love. In reality, it had been about discovering that the greatest power came not from standing above others, but from lifting them up alongside you.
The evening found Kieran on the highest tower, watching stars emerge over a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the one he'd inherited. Below, the capital city sparkled with lights from dozens of different species living in harmony. Dragon forges glowed alongside wolf workshops. Luna-born energy flowed through crystal networks that powered everything from street lamps to the healing centers that treated injuries, regardless of the patient's species or ability to pay. It was everything his ancestors had claimed to want: peace, prosperity, progress. The difference was that they'd tried to achieve it through dominance, while he and Sera had found it through partnership. Contemplating your legacy? Sera's voice carried a note of gentle teasing as she joined him on the battlements. Contemplating the future, he corrected, pulling her close enough to share warmth against the mountain chill. Wondering what our children will think of the world we're building for them. From there, conversation turned to the kinds of hopes that felt safe to voice, now that their kingdom was stable and thriving. Children who would grow up taking cooperation for granted. Leaders who would solve problems through negotiation rather than conquest. A civilization built on the radical idea that strength came from lifting others up, rather than holding them down. What followed was comfortable silence as they watched their people settling into evening routines below. Dragons returning from patrol flights. Wolves gathering for pack meetings that now included multiple species. Luna-born healers finishing their rounds at the hospitals that treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Meanwhile, Kieran reflected on how different leadership felt now compared to his early days as Alpha King. The crushing weight of absolute responsibility had been replaced by the lighter burden of shared governance. Problems that would have kept him awake for weeks now resolved themselves through collaborative effort. "Do you miss it?" Sera asked quietly. "The absolute power? The certainty that came from never having to question your decisions?" Truth be told, the question deserved serious consideration. There had been something seductive about ruling through strength alone. The simplicity of it, the efficiency of decisions that couldn't be questioned or overruled. "No," he said finally, surprised by how certain he felt. "Power without accountability corrupts everything it touches, including the person wielding it." Still, there were moments when he wondered what his ancestors would think of what their bloodline had become. Would they be proud of the peace and prosperity, or horrified by the transformation of absolute monarchy into collaborative leadership? "They'd understand eventually," Sera said, apparently following his thoughts through their bond. "Because you didn't abandon their values. You evolved them. Protection became empowerment. Strength became service. Leadership became partnership. As shooting stars began their ancient dance across the northern sky, Kieran felt the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing your life's work was meaningful. He'd inherited a kingdom built on stolen power and maintained through fear. He was leaving behind a civilization based on freely shared strength and sustained by hope. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.
1 year after the Devourer War, Sera woke to sunlight streaming through windows that no longer needed bars or guards. The nightmares had finally stopped coming. For months after their victory, her dreams had been haunted by memories of powerlessness and pain. But gradually, those dark visions had been replaced by something better. Glimpses of possible futures where the children playing in their courtyards grew up to build wonders that would shame the greatest achievements of previous generations. Next to her, Kieran stirred with the lazy contentment of a male who'd found his perfect match in every sense that mattered. The bond between them had evolved too, settling into something deeper than passion and more durable than romance. Partnership in the truest sense, two souls working together toward goals that neither could achieve alone. "Morning, Your Majesty," he murmured against her hair, voice warm with the kind of affection that made ordinary moments feel precious. "Morning, my king," she replied, though both titles felt more like endearments than political designations now. From there, their day began with the comfortable routines of people who'd learned to find joy in simple things. Breakfast shared while reviewing reports from territories that had once been enemies and were now allies. A walk through gardens where dragon younglings learned to fly alongside wolf pups learning to hunt. What followed was perhaps her favorite part of each day, the morning session where they met with citizens who had concerns or suggestions. Not the formal court proceedings of traditional monarchy, but genuine conversation between leaders and the people they served. "The mining disputes in the Eastern Territories have been resolved," reported Captain Marcus, the young wolf who'd once sparred with her and now served as their chief negotiator. "The dragon forge masters and wolf engineers found a way to extract the ore without damaging the underground ecosystems." Meanwhile, Sera felt the familiar warmth that came from watching their vision become reality. Problems solved through cooperation rather than conquest. conflicts resolved through understanding rather than dominance. "Any word from the expedition to the southern continents?" Kieran asked, referring to the team of mixed-species ambassadors they'd sent to explore territories that had never known supernatural cooperation. "They've made contact with 3 previously unknown magical communities," Marcus replied with obvious excitement, all expressing interest in learning about the new compact. Still, it was the afternoon's personal time that made everything else worthwhile. Hours spent in the library where her father had once read to her, now sharing stories with the children of former enemies who'd become family. Moments in the training yards where she taught young Lunaborn how to channel their abilities safely and ethically. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met?" she asked as they sat together in the herb garden where everything had begun. Truth be told, Kieran's answer came without hesitation. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful we'll never have to find out."
The evening council session represented everything Kieran had hoped their government could become. Around the great table sat representatives from a dozen different species, debating policy with the kind of passionate intensity that came from people who genuinely cared about outcomes rather than just political positioning. Dragons argued economics with wolves. Lunaborn mediated disputes between forest spirits and mountain trolls. Even the smallest magical beings had voices that carried equal weight. "The infrastructure expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule," reported Elder Thane, the dragon whose species had once been their greatest enemies and were now their closest allies. "The crystal network will reach the furthest territories within 6 months." From there, discussion turned to the challenges of rapid growth, how to maintain their values while governing an ever-expanding collection of territories, how to prevent the kind of bureaucratic corruption that had destroyed previous attempts at large-scale cooperation. What followed was exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving that made their system work. Multiple perspectives combining to find solutions that no single species could have developed alone. Wisdom emerging from diversity rather than conformity. Meanwhile, Kieran found himself thinking about legacy in ways that would have been impossible during his early days as Alpha King. Not what history would say about his reign, but what kind of world he was leaving for future generations. "The education initiatives are showing remarkable results," added Luna Elena, a woman whose awakened abilities had made her one of their most effective teachers. "Children who learn cooperation from birth don't seem to understand why anyone would choose conflict." Still, it was Sera's presence beside him that made the future feel real, rather than just hopeful theory. The bond between them had become the foundation for everything they'd built, proof that different natures could not only coexist, but thrive together. "Any other business?" he asked as the session wound toward its natural conclusion. "Just one thing," Sera said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made his pulse quicken. "I wanted everyone to hear this together." Next, she stood with the kind of quiet dignity that had made her a natural leader despite her traumatic past. When she spoke, her words carried across the assembled council like music. "I'm pregnant." Truth be told, the silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before the chamber exploded in celebration. Dragons roared approval that shook the castle foundations. Wolves howled harmonies that made the mountains sing. Even the smallest magical beings added their voices to the joyful chaos. As he pulled Sera into his arms, feeling the future taking shape around them like a promise finally kept, Kieran realized that their story had never really been about saving the world. It had been about learning that love really could conquer anything, even ancient hatreds, cosmic entropy, and the kind of despair that made hope feel impossible. Their child would grow up in a world where cooperation was normal, where different species worked together toward common goals, where strength came from lifting others up rather than holding them down. It was the greatest victory either of them could have imagined.
The sound of children's laughter filled the courtyard as Sera watched her daughter play with a mixed group of younglings that would have been impossible just years ago. Little Lyra Ashwood Blackthorne had inherited her mother's Luna abilities and her father's tactical mind, but she'd also developed something entirely new, the natural ability to communicate with any magical species without conscious effort. She spoke wolf and dragon with equal fluency, could understand the musical language of forest spirits, and had somehow learned to negotiate with mountain trolls despite being barely tall enough to reach their ankles. "She's going to change everything," Kieran observed, settling beside Sera on the garden bench where they'd shared so many important conversations. "She already has," Sera replied, watching their daughter successfully mediate a dispute between a young dragon and wolf over who got to use the practice sword next. "Look at them. They don't even understand why their parents' generation thought cooperation was impossible." From there, conversation turned to the kinds of plans that felt safe to make now that their kingdom was stable and growing. The expansion of educational exchanges between territories, the research initiatives that were discovering new applications for cooperative magic every month, the gradual healing of wounds that had festered for millennia. What followed was comfortable silence as they watched their people, their family really, settling into evening routines that spoke of peace, prosperity, and genuine happiness. "No regrets?" Kieran asked, echoing the question she'd posed to him years ago. "About choosing love over fear?" Sera smiled, the expression feeling as natural as breathing. "About building bridges instead of walls? About proving that broken things can heal stronger than they were before?" Meanwhile, Lyra had apparently resolved the practice sword dispute by suggesting both children work together to defeat an imaginary enemy. Now the young dragon and wolf were coordinating their attacks with the kind of seamless teamwork that would have taken their ancestors years to develop. "Never," she said finally, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "This is exactly where we were always meant to be." As stars began to emerge over the kingdom they'd built from the ashes of ancient conflicts, Sera felt the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing your life had mattered. Not just to yourself or even to your loved ones, but to the entire world. She'd started as a broken girl who believed she deserved suffering. She'd become a queen who proved that love really could conquer anything, even entropy itself. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.
Later that night, after Lyra had been tucked into bed with stories about the heroes who'd built the world she took for granted, Kieran stood once again on the highest tower. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sera stood beside him, their bond as strong as ever, but mellowed by years of shared purpose into something deeper than passion. Around them, the kingdom they'd built together sparkled with lights from a dozen different species living in harmony. "Do you think she'll understand?" he asked, nodding toward their daughter's window. "The price that was paid for the peace she'll inherit?" "She'll understand what matters," Sera replied confidently. "That love is stronger than fear. That cooperation achieves more than conquest. That the greatest strength comes from lifting others up." From there, they talked about the future, with the comfortable certainty of people who'd learned that impossible things became routine when you had the right partner. Plans for their growing family. Dreams for the civilization they were still building. Hope for a world where their daughter's children would take cooperation for granted. What followed was the kind of moment that made all their struggles worthwhile. Perfect contentment with exactly where their lives had led them. "Forever?" he asked, the question carrying echoes of vows spoken in desperation and promises made in hope. "Forever," she confirmed, and he felt the absolute truth of it resonate through every fiber of their shared existence. As shooting stars began their ancient dance across the northern sky, Kieran reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a merchant's disguise designed to investigate corruption, to a love story that had literally reshaped reality. From ancient hatreds that had festered for centuries, to a partnership that proved different natures could not only coexist but thrive together. They'd faced cosmic entropy and chosen love, confronted inevitability and decided hope was stronger, stood against forces that had consumed entire dimensions and proved that connection could triumph over consumption. Their daughter would grow up in a world where such miracles were simply Tuesday. It was the greatest legacy either of them could have imagined. As they made their way back toward warmth and light and the comfortable routines of people who'd found their place in the world, Kieran carried one final thought. Some stories ended with, "and they lived happily ever after." Theirs ended with, "and they built something better." It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.